6,000 years before the Bible was written, a civilization that should not have existed by any conventional measure of history was already cataloging the invisible world in extraordinary detail. They knew their names, they knew their ranks, they knew what they looked like, how they moved, where they lived, and more disturbingly, what they wanted from human beings. The Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia were describing entities so specific, so structurally coherent, so anatomically detailed, that to call them mythology is to willfully ignore the staggering consistency of what they recorded. The Bible, for all its spiritual authority, left things out. Whether deliberately or through the centuries of editorial decisions that shaped the canonical texts we have today, large portions of the original demonology, the detailed, explicit, named taxonomy of dark forces were compressed, removed, or reframed. What survived in Scripture is the silhouette. What the Sumerians gave us is the full portrait. And some of those portraits are things that, once you understand what you're looking at, you will find very difficult to stop thinking about. There is one in particular, the last one we'll examine in this documentary, that occupies a place in Sumerian cosmology so disturbing, so structurally unique, that theologians who have studied both traditions tend to go quiet when asked about it directly. It is not simply evil in the way we commonly understand evil. It is something older than that concept, something that the Anunnaki themselves are described as fearing. Something that existed before the gods ordered the world, and that the ordering of the world was specifically designed to contain. We are going to examine 6 of these entities tonight, not as mythology, not as folklore, as primary source documents, as records. As the written testimony of a civilization that had direct and sustained contact with something, and felt compelled to describe it in exquisite, almost clinical detail. The clay tablets are real. The cuneiform is translated. The scholars have done the work. What they have found does not fit comfortably inside the frameworks we use to understand ancient religion. And it lines up, in ways that cannot be dismissed as coincidence, with fragments of demonological tradition that were officially excluded from the Bible. Tonight you find out what they recorded. You find out what the Bible's editors chose not to include. And at the end of this, you will have to decide for yourself what that means. But before we get to the 6th demon, the one that changes the conversation entirely, we need to understand the world these entities inhabited. We need to understand how the Sumerians conceived of reality itself, because without that foundation, what they described will seem like primitive superstition. With it, it will seem like something else altogether, something uncomfortably like a technical document. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, around 4,500 BCE, though some archaeologists now push certain aspects of their civilization back considerably further. They did not describe themselves as having invented their civilization. They described themselves as having received it. The knowledge of agriculture, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and governance, they said, consistently, across multiple independent texts, was given to them by beings they called the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki translates, in the most literal sense, as those who from heaven to earth came, or, in alternative scholarly transliterations, those of royal blood, or those who are princely offspring. The double meaning is itself significant. It suggests beings who descended physically, literally, spatially, from somewhere above, and who carried with them a lineage of authority that the Sumerians recognized as qualitatively different from human authority. The Anunnaki were not worshipped simply because they were powerful. They were regarded as the original architects of the conditions that made human civilization possible. The Sumerians said this explicitly. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation narratives we have, the gods deliberate over the creation of humanity, create them, and then establish cities in which to place them. The cities are the gods' cities first. Humans are brought in to manage them. This matters for our purposes because the Sumerian understanding of demonic entities comes from within this same cosmological framework. The demons they described were not random monsters. They were inhabitants of a structured universe, with specific jurisdictions, specific behaviors, and specific relationships to the divine hierarchy. They were, in many cases, created beings with assigned functions. And in a few cases, the ones we are going to examine tonight, they were something that even the Anunnaki had not fully anticipated, something that predated the ordering of the cosmos, something left over from before the current arrangement of reality was established. The Sumerians called the period before creation the time of Namu, the primordial sea. Not a sea of water in the physical sense, but a sea of undifferentiated potential, a state before distinction, before above and below, before inside and outside. And from that state, they said, certain things survived into the ordered world. They didn't come from outside the cosmos. They were the residue of what the cosmos was before it became ordered. They were, in effect, the chaos that creation did not fully defeat. The tablets describe two broad categories of dangerous supernatural entity. The first category consists of demons with assigned functions, beings who cause specific diseases, specific mental states, specific misfortunes. These are troubling but comprehensible. They operate within the system. The second category is far more disturbing. Beings that do not operate within the system. Beings that predate the system, that cannot be fully controlled or expelled, that can only be managed, temporarily, through the correct application of knowledge that the Anunnaki themselves pass down to the priests. All 6 of the entities we are examining tonight belong to, or are deeply connected to, that second category. And 2 of them, including the final one, are described in ways that raise questions about the nature of reality itself that the ancient theologians of the biblical tradition clearly decided were too dangerous to include in a text intended for general spiritual instruction. We begin with the one that haunted sleep. The Anzu does not appear in the Bible, not by name, not in any form that the average reader would recognize. But the qualities that Sumerian texts assign to it, its intelligence, its specific form of theft, and what was stolen map onto concepts that appear fragmentarily in multiple traditions, always in connection with catastrophic disruption of cosmic order. The earliest descriptions of the Anzu come from the Anzu epic, recovered from tablets found at Nineveh, Ashur, and Sultan Tepe. The oldest fragments date to approximately 2000 BCE, though the myth itself is almost certainly much older, as its core narrative is referenced in texts from the early dynastic period around 2500 BCE. The Anzu epic was not an obscure religious text. It was one of the central mythological narratives of Mesopotamian civilization, copied and recopied across centuries, studied in scribal schools, and treated with the same gravity that later civilizations would treat their foundational scriptures. The Anzu is described in the epic as a massive bird, specifically a lion-headed eagle of immense size. But this physical description is almost immediately complicated by what the text says about its nature. It is not merely a large predatory animal. It is something that understands, something that thinks, something that evaluated the cosmic structure it observed and made a deliberate decision about what to take from it. The Anzu, according to the epic, was placed by the great god Enlil in charge of the entrance to the divine sanctuary where Enlil kept the Tablet of Destinies. This is important. The Anzu was not an invader. It was an insider. It had been given a position of trust within the divine order, specifically because it was powerful enough to guard what needed to be guarded. What it guarded was the Tablet of Destinies, the ME, the single most significant object in Sumerian cosmology. The ME was not simply a list of rules. It was the encoding of existence itself. It contained, according to multiple texts, the principles that governed every aspect of reality: kingship, priesthood, warfare, music, descent into the underworld, descent from the underworld, the scribal arts, the craft of the smith, the standard, the quiver, the art of lovemaking, prostitution, the cult prostitute, the tavern, the hero, power, enmity, the descent of the god, the ascent of the god, music, eldership, the flood, the hearing of prayer. The tablets list over 100 specific aspects of civilization and cosmic function, all of which were encoded in this one object. Whoever held the Tablet of Destinies controlled the operating system of reality. The Anzu understood this. And one morning the text is very specific that this happened in the morning, at the moment when Enlil had removed the tablet to bathe. Setting it aside, the Anzu took it, not through force. Through patience, observation, and timing. It had been watching. It had been placed inside the divine system precisely long enough to understand how the system worked, and then it exploited the one moment of vulnerability that the system allowed. When the Anzu flew away with the Tablet of Destinies, the text describes what happened to reality in immediate and terrifying terms. Silence fell over everything. The gods could not speak. Commands could not be issued. The functioning of the divine hierarchy, the entire administrative structure that maintained cosmic order, froze, because the tablet encoded the authority to issue commands. Without it, words of power had no power. Decrees had no force. The machinery of reality had been unplugged at the source. This is not a story about a monster stealing a magic item. This is a story about a being that understood the architecture of reality well enough to identify the single intervention point that would collapse it. The Anzu is not described as acting out of rage or hunger or territorial aggression. It is described as acting out of desire. It wanted what the tablet represented. It wanted the power to decree fates. It wanted to become the source of authority rather than the servant of it. The Sumerian scholars who composed and preserved this text were describing something philosophically precise, a being of immense intelligence and power that had been integrated into the divine order had used that position to fully understand the divine order, and then had turned that understanding against the order it served. The Anzu is the original insider threat. The original Lucifer, in the most structural sense of that figure, not in terms of the later Christian elaborations, but in terms of the core mythological logic. The brilliance that was closest to the light decided it wanted to be the light. The gods are described as falling into paralysis. Anu, the sky god, calls for volunteers to confront the Anzu and retrieve the tablet. One after another, the great gods refuse. This is significant. The text does not describe them as cowardly. It describes them as pragmatic. To fight the Anzu while it holds the tablet is to fight a being that can now alter the outcome of the fight itself. The Tablet of Destinies includes the destinies of the gods. Whoever holds it can rewrite those destinies. To attack the Anzu is to potentially hand it the authority to simply decide that you lose. The hero who eventually confronts the Anzu is Ninurta, the warrior god, son of Enlil. And even Ninurta's first attack fails. Because the Anzu uses the tablet to speak the destinies of Ninurta's weapons, the feathered arrows dissolve back into the reeds they came from. The metal of the axe reverts to its ore. The Anzu does not fight with its own power. It fights by rewriting the nature of the weapons being used against it. It is not invulnerable. It is adaptive. It turns the logic of each attack against itself. The solution, and this is the part that the ancient scribes treated as containing specialized knowledge, comes from the advice of Ea, the god of wisdom. Ea tells Ninurta to let the Anzu speak the destiny of the arrows. Let it turn them back into reeds, and then command the reeds, not as arrows, but as reeds as plants, that the wind scatters. The Anzu cannot prevent wind from scattering reeds. It can only alter the destinies of things insofar as they are weapons aimed at it. If Ninurta commands the parts of the weapon rather than the weapon itself, the Tablet of Destinies cannot speak a counter-destiny fast enough. Ninurta follows this advice. The feathers of the arrows scatter like a storm. The tips find the Anzu before the tablet can speak. The Anzu falls. The tablet is recovered. But here is what the biblical tradition left out of its demonology: the nature of what the Anzu represented. The later Jewish and Christian frameworks, drawing on earlier Mesopotamian influences, preserved the figure of the corrupted divine being, the servant of God who turned. But they simplified the mechanics. They made it about pride and rebellion, a moral failing. What the Sumerian text describes is something more structurally specific, a being that weaponized understanding itself. The Anzu's crime was not pride, it was knowledge applied to sabotage. It was the recognition that the system had a vulnerability, and the patience to exploit it at the precise right moment. The later demonological traditions that emerged from the biblical world do not fully develop this concept. There are fragments of it in the figure of the serpent in Genesis, who speaks truth in a way that has consequences, but the full portrait of the thinking adversary, the being that understands reality's code well enough to rewrite it, never fully develops in canonical scripture. It was left in the Sumerian texts. It was left in the clay. What makes this particularly significant for the ancient astronaut interpretation that this documentary is engaging with is the specific nature of what the Anzu stole. The Tablet of Destinies, the ME, is described in Sumerian texts not as a metaphysical concept, but as a physical object. It is described as something that can be taken off and set aside, something that can be held, hidden, and transported. Zecharia Sitchin and other ancient astronaut theorists have argued that the ME was a technological artifact, something analogous to a control system, a transmitter, or what we might now call a master controller for the infrastructure of Anunnaki civilization. From this perspective, the Anzu's theft is not a mythological story about cosmic pride. It is a record of a specific incident. An entity with access to an advanced technological system identified the moment when its operators were distracted, seized the system, and used it to render their technology inoperable. Whether or not one accepts the ancient astronaut interpretation, what cannot be dismissed is the level of strategic intelligence the Sumerian text ascribes to the Anzu. This is not a beast. It is not a force of nature. It is an entity that thinks, plans, waits, and acts with purpose. An entity that understands systems well enough to break them from within. And it was real enough to the Sumerians that they built an entire mytho-theological framework around preventing a recurrence of what it did, around the concept that certain kinds of power require not just guardians, but guardians who do not fully understand what they are guarding. Because the Anzu understood what it was guarding. And that was the problem. The bird that thinks is not in your Bible, but the concept it embodies, the subversion of divine order by a being of divine origin, is the shadow that falls over the entire Western theological tradition. The Sumerians gave it a name. They gave it a face. They gave it a body and a motive and a method. And then they wrote down, in careful cuneiform, how it was eventually stopped. And the method of stopping it is worth sitting with for a moment. You cannot fight it directly. You cannot use the system it has corrupted to defeat it. You have to go under the system. You have to operate at a level the system cannot see. You have to find the part of reality that predates the encoding, that exists in the raw material before it becomes a weapon, and work from there. That is the advice of the God of wisdom. That is what works against the Anzu. And that is the first thing the Bible did not tell you. The canonical Bible has an adversary. It has a tempter. It has fallen angels, corrupted servants, principalities of darkness. What it does not have, what was systematically, and one suspects deliberately, removed from the Western theological framework, is the demonic feminine. The female principle that is not corrupted goodness, not the fallen servant who wanted too much, but something that is predatory by nature, by design, by the specific way it was constituted from the beginning. The Sumerians had no such inhibition. Lamashtu is one of the most extensively documented supernatural entities in all of ancient Mesopotamian literature. Hundreds of amulets bearing her image have been recovered from archaeological sites across the ancient Near East. Dozens of incantation tablets describe her in detail. Exorcism rituals, specifically designed to drive her away, were among the most commonly performed religious ceremonies in ancient Mesopotamia for over 2,000 years. She was not a minor local spirit. She was a major supernatural presence that the civilization took profoundly seriously and whose reach extended, in the form of her textual and material traces, across multiple cultures and centuries. What is Lamashtu? The primary texts describe her as the daughter of Anu, the highest sky god, the father of the divine pantheon. This detail is crucial and tends to be underemphasized in popular treatments. Lamashtu is not a demon in the sense of a being created to serve evil functions. She is divine in origin. She was born from the same divine source as the gods who established and maintained cosmic order. She is not a corruption of goodness. She is a daughter of the highest power, who was constituted in a particular way, and that constitution led directly to the behavior that made her the most feared entity in the daily life of ordinary Mesopotamian people. She is described physically in terms that the Sumerian scribes clearly considered important to record with precision. She has the head of a lion. Her teeth are the teeth of a donkey, a detail that sounds absurd until you understand that the donkey's teeth, in Mesopotamian symbolic vocabulary, represent grinding, relentless persistence. She has the claws of a bird of prey, specifically an eagle, according to most texts. She has the body of a woman. She stands, in most artistic representations, either kneeling over an infant or nursing infants at her breasts, while simultaneously nursing a pig and a dog, the two animals most associated in Sumerian cosmology with filth and the underworld, respectively. She carries a comb in one hand and a spindle in the other. She is, depending on the text, depicted crossing water on a boat, or riding on the back of a donkey, or standing in a reed boat in the marshes. The comb and spindle are particularly significant. These are the tools of feminine domesticity in ancient Mesopotamia. The comb and spindle appear in texts and representations as symbols of the proper function of women caring for the household, maintaining the home, nurturing children. Lamashtu carries them as a parody. She performs the gestures of the nurturing feminine while doing precisely the opposite of what those gestures are supposed to accomplish. Because what Lamashtu does, according to every text, every amulet inscription, every incantation designed to repel her, is attack the most vulnerable. Specifically, pregnant women, newborns, and infants still nursing. She does not attack warriors. She does not challenge kings. She does not confront priests or gods. She targets the moment of maximum vulnerability in human biological life, the moment of birth, the moment of earliest infancy, and she destroys it. She causes miscarriage. She causes stillbirth. She causes death in newborns. She is described as reaching into the womb to seize the child. She is described as putting her finger to the soft spot on an infant's head and drawing the life out through it. She is described as pressing her face to nursing infants and replacing the mother's milk with something else. The Sumerian texts are explicit about the mechanisms. They are not metaphorical. The incantation tablets describe her approach in physical terms. She comes from the desert, from the mountains, she crosses water, she enters through windows and through doorways, she slips through cracks in the wall. She finds the woman in labor or the newborn in its cradle, and she acts. The god Pazuzu, who will be familiar to anyone who has seen a certain 1973 film, though that film got the nature of the relationship between Pazuzu and Lamashtu somewhat muddled, is invoked against Lamashtu in numerous amulets. Pazuzu is himself a demonic figure. the king of the wind demons, described as having a dog-like face, the talons of an eagle, 2 pairs of wings, and a scorpion's tail. He is not benevolent in any conventional sense, but Pazuzu and Lamashtu were understood to be in a relationship of mutual hostility, and Pazuzu's antagonism toward her could be exploited by humans seeking protection. You place the face of Pazuzu in the room of a woman in labor not because Pazuzu was good, but because Pazuzu hated Lamashtu, and the presence of his image would cause her to retreat. This is a sophisticated demonological framework. The Sumerians were not operating with a binary of divine good against demonic evil. They were operating with a complex ecology of supernatural beings, some of whom were deeply dangerous, and some of whose dangers could be mitigated by exploiting rivalries within that ecology. Humans were not protected by the simple presence of divinity. They were protected by understanding the specific social dynamics of the supernatural world well enough to play different factions against each other. The later biblical tradition collapses this ecology almost entirely. There is God. There are angels. There is the adversary. There are demons. The complex web of supernatural relationships, hierarchies, rivalries, and social dynamics that the Sumerians documented over millennia is reduced to a stark binary. This simplification was probably theologically intentional. It served the monotheistic project of centralizing divine authority. But it cost the tradition something important: the detailed operational knowledge of how the dangerous entities actually behaved and what specific interventions could interrupt that behavior. Lamashtu's textual record gives us that operational knowledge in extraordinary detail. The Maklu series, a collection of Babylonian incantation texts that represents the most comprehensive anti-demonic ritual literature in the ancient world, devotes significant attention to Lamashtu and to the specific conditions under which she can be repelled. The texts describe her weakness as her pride. She believes herself above other demons. She believes herself above human resistance. This belief is described as the specific point of leverage that a skilled exorcist can exploit, not through power, because no human has power sufficient to confront a daughter of Anu directly, but through knowledge of her nature that she does not expect humans to possess. This is the recurrent theme of Sumerian demonology that the Bible quietly erased. Knowledge as the operative defense, not faith, not righteousness, not prayer in the sense of emotional supplication. Knowledge specific, precise, operational knowledge of the nature and behavior and weaknesses of each specific entity. The Maklu texts are, in this sense, less like religious scripture and more like technical manuals. They describe procedures. They describe precise conditions. They describe what to say, in what order, using what materials, at what time of day, in what physical orientation. The specific content of the knowledge matters. Generalized invocations of divine protection are not treated as sufficient. Now, consider what this implies about the ancient astronaut interpretation that serious scholars in this field have been developing. If the Anunnaki were not purely supernatural beings, but were instead representatives of an advanced civilization, a civilization with technological capabilities that Sumerian observers encoded in mythological language, then the operational knowledge that the priests deployed in their ritual work, takes on a different character. It becomes something more like a database. A set of protocols for managing interactions with a complex and partially dangerous set of entities whose behavior could be predicted and whose vulnerabilities could be exploited if you had access to the right information. Lamashtu, from this perspective, is not a mythological metaphor for the dangers of childbirth, though she clearly functioned on that symbolic level for ordinary Mesopotamian people. She is something more specific, a documented entity with consistent and predictable behaviors, known weaknesses, and a specific domain of operation that the civilization had developed concrete countermeasures against. The amulets, the incantations, the ritual procedures, these are not the products of desperate superstition. They are the accumulated and systematically organized knowledge base of a civilization that had been dealing with this entity for long enough to develop a sophisticated response protocol. The detail about her being the daughter of Anu, the highest divine authority, is particularly striking from this perspective. She is not rogue chaos from outside the system. She is an authorized product of the same source that authorized everything else. She is a daughter of the highest power who was, for reasons the texts do not fully explain, never brought under the administrative control that the other children of Anu operated within. She exists at the edge of the divine order. Not outside it, she is too clearly of divine origin to be outside it. Not inside it, she is too clearly uncontrollable to be inside it. She exists in the threshold between the ordered divine world and whatever was before that ordering, and she uses that threshold position to do what she does. What the Bible left out of its account is this specific figure, the being of divine origin who was not corrupted and did not fall, but who was simply constituted in a way that makes her incompatible with the requirements of an ordered world. Not evil in the sense of having chosen evil, not fallen in the sense of having lost a better state, but predatory, in the same way that certain natural phenomena are predatory not morally but functionally. The thing she does is what she is. She is not doing it against her better nature. She is expressing her nature completely. The Western theological tradition found this concept deeply troubling. A being of divine origin that was not fallen, not corrupted, not redeemable, not even oppositional in any coherent moral sense, simply constituted in a way that produced destruction, does not fit neatly into a framework built around the narrative of cosmic moral conflict. It does not fit into the story of a God who is good, a creation that was good, a fall that corrupted what was good, and a redemption that will restore what was good. Lamashtu is not part of that narrative structure. She is something older than that structure, something that predates the moral categories that structure requires. And so, she was left in the clay tablets, in hundreds of amulets, in ritual texts that were used for over 2,000 years by people who had very good experiential reasons for believing she was real. But not in the Bible. Not in any form that the canonical tradition preserved in explicit, named, detailed terms. She is there in shadow, in the unnamed entities that kill infants in the night, in the figure that appears without detailed description in certain apocryphal texts, Lilith, who shares certain characteristics with Lamashtu, and who almost certainly represents the same deep mythological current flowing into Hebrew tradition through the enormous influence of Babylonian culture. But Lilith herself was eventually excluded from the canonical text. She appears in Isaiah as a word that was eventually translated as screech owl, the human translators choosing to render as an animal what the Hebrew text may have intended as a specific demonic entity. The daughter of Anu, the one who reaches into the womb, the one who cannot be commanded by the gods and must instead be managed by exploiting her rivalries and her pride, she was too complex, too morally ambiguous, too resistant to the clean narrative of divine authority over supernatural evil to be given a full presence in the text that would shape Western religious consciousness for 2 millennia. She was left in Mesopotamia, in the clay that preserved her name, in the amulets that preserved her face, in the ritual texts that preserved the exact procedures that, for 2,000 years of lived human experience, were understood to work. We do not know if they worked. We do not know what Lamashtu was. We know what the Sumerians said she was, with a consistency and a specificity and a duration of documentation that demands to be taken seriously. And we know that a significant body of knowledge about her, developed over thousands of years of sustained engagement with whatever she represented, was eventually dropped from the tradition that came to dominate the Western understanding of the supernatural world. What we are left with is an absence, a shape in the record where something should be, and if you look at the shape carefully enough, you can see exactly what was removed. A lion's face, donkey's teeth, eagle's claws, a woman's body, a comb and a spindle, infants at her breasts that are not infants she loves, infants at her breasts that she is consuming, a boat in the marshes, a donkey in the desert, a daughter of the highest God answering to nothing. That is the second thing the Bible did not tell you. There is a category of demonic entity in Sumerian cosmology that the later Western traditions encoded partially, incompletely, and in ways that stripped away the most disturbing elements of the original description. They are called the Udug-hul, a term that translates approximately as evil spirits or evil demons, though that translation loses something important in the move from Cuneiform to English. The Udug-hul are not individual named entities in most of their textual appearances. They are a category, a type, a species of supernatural being whose nature is defined less by their individual characteristics and more by a set of shared qualities that, when you examine them in full, constitute something philosophically extraordinary. The primary source document for understanding the Udug-hul is a collection of texts known as the Udug-hul incantations, part of the larger corpus of Babylonian exorcism literature preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, discovered in the 19th century, and gradually translated over the following 100 years. The collection is extensive, running to multiple tablets, and the level of detail it provides about the nature and behavior of these entities is remarkable. The Udug-hul incantations begin with a description of the entities that, from the perspective of almost any framework of ontology, ancient or modern, constitutes one of the most genuinely disturbing characterizations of a class of supernatural being that exists in the ancient record. They do not have a mother who gave birth to them. They do not have a father who knows them. They were not born in the mountains. they are not known among the gods. Their names are not recorded in the register of the heavens. Read that again. Not as religious poetry. Read it as a technical description. In Sumerian cosmology, everything that exists has a genealogy. Everything that is real has an origin point that can be traced. The gods have mothers and fathers. The created world has creators. Even the dangerous supernatural entities, Lamashtu, the Anzu, the various disease demons have origins within the divine order. They came from somewhere. They were made by something. Their existence is traceable. The Udug-hul have no traceable existence. They do not appear in any divine genealogy. They have no parents, no creator, no point of origin that can be located within the established cosmic structure. The incantations say this explicitly, and they say it as if it is the most important thing to understand about these entities. Before describing what they do, the texts first establish, carefully, what they are not. They are not offspring of any known power. They are not registered anywhere in the divine administrative record. They are not known to the gods. This is not a description of demons as corrupted servants. This is not a description of fallen angels. This is a description of entities that are, in the most literal sense, outside the system of being that the gods created and maintain. They existed in whatever existed before the current order was established. They are not part of the creation. They are the other, the things that were already there when the Anunnaki began their work, things that the ordering of reality did not eliminate, things that simply are, without authorization from any source that the organized divine hierarchy recognizes. The incantations go on to describe the behavior of the Udug-hul in terms that are just as philosophically precise as the description of their origin. They do not eat food, they do not drink water. They are not appeased by flower offerings. They do not enjoy libations. They do not accept the pleasures that humans and gods share. They take no pleasure in offerings of silver or bronze. They cannot be satisfied. They have no satisfaction threshold. There is nothing you can give them that will cause them to leave, because they do not want anything you could give. What they do, the harm they cause, is not motivated by hunger, desire, grievance, or any of the motivations that make sense within a framework of beings that have needs. This is theologically catastrophic for any tradition built on the logic that supernatural evil can be appeased, bargained with, satisfied, or redeemed. If evil is motivated by desire, by pride, by hunger, by longing for something denied, then it is, in principle, addressable. You can potentially satisfy the desire, or offer something in exchange for the harm to stop, or appeal to a higher power that can overrule the desire. The entire structure of intercession, prayer, sacrifice, ritual is premised on the idea that what harms you wants something, and that something can potentially be negotiated. The Udug-hul want nothing. They are not hungry, they are not proud, they are not grieved. They are not defiant. They are not anything that would make them comprehensible as agents within a moral framework. They cause harm the way wind causes structural damage to a building, not because the wind wants the building gone, but because the wind and the building are simply incompatible, and the wind does not modify its behavior to accommodate that incompatibility. The harm is not purposeful. It is structural. And yet, and this is where the Sumerian demonological texts become genuinely extraordinary, the Udug-hul can be driven away, not appeased, not satisfied, not bargained with, but driven away. Through the application of specific knowledge, specific words, spoken in specific orders, activating specific divine authority, the Udug-hul can be compelled to leave. The mechanism the texts describe is not prayer. It is not supplication. It is not an appeal to divine mercy. It is something closer to what we might call a technical interrupt. The exorcist invokes the authority of Asaluhi, the son of Enki, and the primary divine figure associated with exorcism, and uses that authority to issue a command that the Udug-hul cannot refuse. Not because they choose to comply, but because the authority being invoked operates at a level that supersedes whatever it is that constitutes the Udug-hul's autonomy. What does this remind you of? If you are thinking about computer systems, you are thinking about exactly what the ancient astronaut theorists suggest you should be thinking about. A process that runs in the background of an operating system that was not installed by any authorized source, that does not respond to user-level commands, that cannot be negotiated with or appeased, can nonetheless be terminated by someone with root-level access. Not because the process understands and agrees to stop, but because root-level authority supersedes process-level autonomy. The Udug-hul are described in the incantations as crossing over walls, passing through gates, sliding through doorposts like water through sand. They have no physical substance that barriers can stop. They are not beings in the conventional sense of occupying a discrete spatial location. They are more like conditions, states that a space or a person enters into without a physical source that can be blocked. The boundary between the ordered world and whatever they represent is not a physical boundary. It is a categorical one, and maintaining that categorical boundary requires continuous, skilled, specific effort. The incantations describe Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, the primary divine patron of knowledge and craft, as having established the protocols for dealing with the Udug Hul before the current cosmic order was fully in place. Before there were humans, before there were priests, before there was a civilization with exorcists to practice these techniques. The knowledge of how to repel the Udug Hul was encoded into the structure of the organized world as a prerequisite for the organized world's survival. It was not discovered by human ingenuity. It was provided as infrastructure by the architects of the order that the Udug Hul threatened. This detail, the pre-existence of the protective protocols, is one of the elements that the biblical tradition most significantly reduced. In the biblical framework, humans receive divine assistance against supernatural evil, primarily through faith, righteousness, and prayer. The assistance is conditional on the human's spiritual state. In the Sumerian framework, the assistance is technical. The protocols exist independently of anyone's faith. They work because they are correctly applied, not because the person applying them is spiritually worthy. This is a fundamentally different epistemological model of supernatural protection, and it is the model that the detailed records of the Udug Hul incantations most powerfully support. What the canonical biblical tradition kept from this body of thought is the general concept of the demon that cannot be bargained with, that must be commanded rather than appeased. This appears in the New Testament in the accounts of exorcism, where the formula is not a prayer for divine help, but a command issued in the name of authority. Go out, leave, be gone. The command structure of biblical exorcism is directly descended from the command structure of Mesopotamian exorcism, carrying the logic of technical intervention, even while the theological framework has been simplified and morized. What was left out is the philosophical foundation that explains why command works. Because the Udug Hul are not moral agents, and therefore moral appeals to them are meaningless. They are not choosing to harm. They are not capable of choosing not to harm. They cannot hear an appeal. They can only be interrupted by a signal that operates at a level above their functional range, and the signal that operates at that level is not righteousness or sincerity. It is knowledge, specific knowledge of the specific authority required and the specific form that authority must take to be effective. The Udug Hul also appear in a cosmological context that the Bible specifically chose not to preserve, the idea that they are not ultimately evil in any transcendent sense, but simply incompatible with the conditions that human life requires. They are not agents of a cosmic adversary. They are not elements of a divine plan. They are residue, pre-cosmic flotsam, the things left over from before the current arrangement of existence. The reason they cannot be negotiated with is not that they are implacably evil. It is that they do not operate within any framework that would make negotiation meaningful, and that the entity that is harmful not because it opposes good, but because it simply predates the categories in which good and evil have meaning, is precisely what the monotheistic tradition could not accommodate without, undermining the foundation of its entire moral architecture. A universe in which some things simply exist outside moral categories that cannot be prayed to, cannot be appealed to, cannot be redeemed, cannot be understood as instruments of divine purpose is a universe that does not belong entirely to a God who is good and whose purposes are ultimately comprehensible. The Udug Hul implied a remainder, a surplus of existence that the creation story did not fully account for. And a God who is fully sovereign does not leave remainders, so the remainder was left in the clay tablets. And the tradition built on that clay was simplified into something more morally coherent, more spiritually navigable, and considerably less complete. The ones without shadow, the ones without parents, the ones whose names are not in the register of heaven, they are the third thing the Bible did not tell you. If you have read the Bible carefully, you will have noticed something about its treatment of the underworld. Sheol, the Hebrew realm of the dead, is described in terms that are remarkably vague for a tradition that is generally quite specific about things it considers important. It is a place of silence, a place of dust, a place where the dead do not praise God. But it is not described with anything approaching the operational specificity with which the Sumerians described their underworld, and it is notably free of the kind of detailed bureaucratic structure that the Mesopotamian tradition applied to the administration of the dead. This is not an accident of tradition. The Hebrew encounter with Babylonian thought during the period of the exile, roughly 586 to 538 BCE, was profound and extensive, And the influence of Mesopotamian cosmology on the late development of Hebrew theological concepts is well documented. What the biblical editors received from that encounter, they filtered carefully. What they kept, they simplified. And what they simplified most aggressively was the concept of what inhabited the underworld, and what happened when what inhabited the underworld came up. The Gallu are the underworld bailiffs of Sumerian cosmology. They are referenced in multiple texts, most extensively in the Descent of Inanna, one of the oldest and most important narrative texts in the Sumerian corpus, describing the journey of the goddess Inanna into the realm of the dead ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. The Gallu appear in this text as the enforcement agents of the underworld beings, whose specific function is to ensure that no one who enters the realm of the dead leaves it without paying the correct price. They are described in the Descent of Inanna in terms that the text treats as self-evidently important to specify. They are beings who know no food and know no drink. They do not accept the flower offerings scattered in front of them. They do not enjoy libations of beer offered to them repeating the formula used for the Udug Hul, but with additional specificity. They do not accept the satisfaction of a wife's embraces. They have no pleasure in the bouncing of children on their knees. They snatch the son from the knee of his father. They snatch the daughter-in-law from the house of her father-in-law. They carry no weapons and feel no need for weapons. What they carry is the authority of the underworld itself. They move through the world above with an administrative certainty that does not require physical force. They are not hunting, they are collecting. They are executing the judgments of the realm of the dead with the same dispassionate efficiency that human bailiffs execute civil judgments. The law they serve is not the law of the divine order above. It is the law of the realm below. And those two laws, in Sumerian cosmology, are not always perfectly aligned. The narrative situation in the Descent of Inanna that involves the Gallu most directly is the following. Inanna descends into the underworld, passes through its 7 gates, surrendering one element of her divine authority at each gate, and arrives before Ereshkigal naked and stripped of power. Ereshkigal kills her. Inanna hangs as a corpse on a hook for 3 days. Her vizier Ninshuber, following Inanna's prior instructions, appeals to the gods for help. Eventually, Enki sends 2 beings created from the dirt under his fingernail who revive Inanna by touching her corpse with the food and water of life. Inanna is resurrected. She prepares to ascend. But the laws of the underworld do not permit a free return. The Gallu accompany her out of the underworld, and the law they enforce is precise. No one leaves the realm of the dead without providing a substitute. Inanna must give someone to take her place. The Gallu travel with her through the world above, offering various figures who weep at her absence and clearly mourn her, and at each such figure, Inanna prevents the Gallu from taking them, saying, in effect, "These mourn for me, take them not," until she arrives at her own city Kulab and finds her husband Dumuzi on his throne dressed in his finest garments, not mourning, not weeping, apparently comfortable in her absence. And Inanna gives him her look of death, and the Gallu take him. The Gallu in this narrative are not villains. They are not evil in any simple sense. They are the agents of a law that is presented as structurally necessary, the law that maintains the boundary between the living and the dead. The underworld must have its occupant in exchange for each departure. This law is not described as unjust. It is described as foundational. It is the price of resurrection, a life for a life. This narrative structure, the descent, the death, the 3-day suspension, the resurrection, the return accompanied by agents who will demand a substitute, is sufficiently similar to the central narrative of the Christian New Testament that scholars have been debating the relationship between them for over a century. Whether the Inanna narrative directly influenced the New Testament accounts, or whether both narratives draw on a common mythological substrate, or whether the structural similarities are simply the result of independent derivations from universal patterns of death and resurrection mythology, these remain genuinely contested questions in the study of comparative religion. What is not contested is that the structural similarities are real, extensive, and specific enough to demand explanation rather than dismissal. What is relevant for our purposes is the figure of the Gallu specifically, and what happens when they come up. The Gallu are not confined to the underworld. They appear in other texts traveling in the world above as agents executing underworld judgments. They are described in certain incantation texts as entities that can be encountered in the land of the living, not as residents but as travelers on official business. And the business they are on is always the same, the collection of what the underworld is owed. The most disturbing element of their description, from the perspective of what the biblical tradition left out, is this. They cannot be appealed to on the basis of mercy. They do not have mercy. Mercy is a function of relationships. You are merciful to someone because you stand in some kind of relational position to them. Kinship, obligation, affection, or at minimum the recognition of shared existence. The Galyu do not stand in relational positions to the living. They are not enemies of the living, in the sense that an enemy recognizes your existence and opposes it. They are bureaucrats whose paperwork concerns you, and whose execution of that paperwork is not modified by anything you might say or feel or offer. This is the concept that the biblical tradition found most theologically problematic about the Sumerian underworld mythology, the idea that the dead have claims on the living that operate according to their own law, and that the living can neither fully understand nor fully resist those claims. The dead do not simply depart in the Sumerian framework. They remain embedded in a legal system that continues to have jurisdiction over certain aspects of the living world. And the Galyu are the enforcement mechanism that makes that jurisdiction real. The biblical tradition, over the course of its development, worked to establish a clear boundary between the living and the dead, and to place that boundary entirely under divine sovereignty. The dead are in Sheol. God rules Sheol. The dead do not have independent claims on the living. The living's obligations to God supersede any obligations to the dead. This project of theological simplification required the elimination of the Galyu as a concept, the elimination of the idea that the underworld had its own administrative autonomy, its own laws, its own agents who operated in the living world on underworld business. The agents of the underworld appear in the biblical tradition primarily as eschatological figures, the angels of judgment at the end of days, rather than as active presences in the ordinary world of the living. This is a significant displacement. In Sumerian cosmology, the Galyu were present now, always, a continuous background fact of existence. In the biblical framework, agents of the underworld's authority are deferred to a future moment of cosmic resolution. This deferral is psychologically important. It creates a period of safety, of separation, in which the living world is clearly governed by God rather than by competing claims from below. But it achieves that safety by eliminating, from the everyday theological landscape, a class of entity that the Sumerians treated as a continuous and practically significant presence. What ancient astronaut theorists have noted about the Galyu is the administrative precision with which they are described. They do not act on impulse. They do not act on hatred. They act on authority, according to protocol, with a specificity that is more consistent with bureaucratic function than with the behavior of supernatural monsters. They carry no weapons. They need no weapons. Their authority is sufficient. They are not enforcing a cosmic moral order. They are enforcing a specific legal framework whose jurisdiction is defined by category, the category of the dead, rather than by morality. Zecharia Sitchin and others in the ancient astronaut tradition have argued that the underworld of Sumerian cosmology, the Kur, should be understood not as a metaphysical dimension, but as a physical location, possibly underground, possibly in another region of the earth. From this perspective, the Galyu are not supernatural entities, but administrative personnel operating from a physical base whose technology and authority was sufficient to make them effectively unstoppable by ordinary humans. The laws they enforced were not cosmic laws in a metaphysical sense, but operational rules governing what the Anunnaki infrastructure did and did not permit, and resurrection, the return of the dead to the living world without authorized exchange, was something that the system did not permit without cost. Whether or not you accept this reading, what is undeniable is that the Sumerian description of the Galyu is one of the most consistent and internally coherent depictions of a specific class of supernatural entity in the entire ancient record. They appear in multiple texts, across multiple centuries, described with remarkable consistency. They are not randomly terrifying. They are specifically functional, and their function, the enforcement of a law that maintains the boundary between two domains of existence, is one of the most genuinely unsettling concepts in ancient Mesopotamian thought. Unsettling not because the Galyu are evil, but because they represent a system that exists alongside the human world, that occasionally intersects with the human world, and whose operations are not subject to the ordinary modes of human appeal or divine intercession. They enforce a law that was established before humanity existed, that runs independently of divine moral authority, and that cannot be bargained with because it has no interest in being bargained with. That concept, the law that runs beneath the divine moral order, older than it, not subject to it, inexorably enforced, was too structurally dangerous for the biblical tradition to accommodate. Because a God who is fully sovereign does not share administrative jurisdiction with the underworld. A God who is fully sovereign does not leave regions of reality under the authority of a parallel legal system, with its own agents and its own enforcement. And so the Galyu were left in the clay, in the descent of Inanna, in the incantation texts, In the underworld mythology that 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization treated as seriously as they treated anything, they are the fourth thing the Bible did not tell you. The Asaku began as a specific type of disease demon in early Sumerian texts and evolved across the centuries of Mesopotamian literary tradition into something considerably more philosophically complex. By the time of the later Babylonian texts, the Asaku had become associated not just with illness, but with a specific quality of existence, a quality that is difficult to translate into modern terms, but that the ancient scribes clearly felt was important to define with: precision. The earliest references to the Asaku, the term appears in texts from as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, describe it as a demon of disease, particularly of fever and wasting illness. It is associated with the mountains, with high and remote places, with the boundary between the human-inhabited world and the wilderness that surrounds it. It is attracted to the sick and the weakened. It is repelled by the healthy and the strong. It is not described as choosing its victims in any morally selective way. It is simply drawn to vulnerability, the way certain parasites are drawn to physiological conditions that allow them to survive. The Asaku does not select, it responds. This early description already contains the seed of what makes the Asaku philosophically interesting in its later development: the relationship between the Asaku and the state of the being it inhabits. The Asaku does not simply attack from outside and cause illness. It is specifically associated with states of being that make a person susceptible to it. The illness and the Asaku are in a feedback relationship. The illness attracts the Asaku intensifies the intensified illness attracts more Asaku influence, in a cycle that the texts describe as having the quality of a progressive deterioration without a natural stopping point. But the later development of the Asaku concept is where the texts become genuinely extraordinary. By the time of the Marduk ordeal texts and the later Babylonian mythological corpus, the Asaku has a more specific cosmological identity. It is associated with a primordial conflict, a war, in the language of the texts, between the Asaku and the forces of divine order, led by Ninurta, that took place at the foundation of the current cosmic arrangement. The Lugal-e, a major Sumerian literary composition describing the exploits of Ninurta, describes a battle between Ninurta and the Asaku, who is described in this context not as a disease demon but as a cosmic power. The Asaku in the Lugal-e is the offspring of An, the sky, and Ki, the earth, and it has gathered a host of stone warriors, actual beings made of stone, to challenge the divine order. Ninurta defeats the Asaku in pitched battle, and after the victory, he sorts through the stones that constituted the Asaku's army, determining which stones will henceforth be precious and which will be common, which will have power and which will be merely material. This mythological elaboration is significant for several reasons. First, it establishes the Asaku as a being of cosmic scope, not merely a disease demon, but a primordial power whose defeat was part of the establishment of the current order of the world. Second, it establishes the post-defeat Asaku's energy as something that was distributed through the physical world in the form of the properties of stones and minerals, the beneficial properties of lapis lazuli, carnelian, and other precious stones are explicitly described as properties that Ninurta assigned to them after the defeat of the Asaku, suggesting that what was dangerous in concentrated form became beneficial in distributed form. Third, it establishes a precedent for understanding the disease demon Asaku and the cosmic power Asaku as two aspects of the same entity, or more precisely, as the two states of the same energy: concentrated, in which it is destructive; distributed, in which it can be beneficent. The ancient astronaut reading of this narrative is striking: a primordial power that was defeated and then distributed through physical matter, specifically through crystalline and metallic materials, as the establishment of the current cosmic order. Sitchin and others have argued that this describes something that sounds, in the framework of modern physics, like the distribution of a form of energy through physical matter as a consequence of some earlier event. The defeated Asaku does not simply cease to exist. It is transformed. Its destructive potential is broken up and assigned to specific physical substances in controlled quantities. The very properties of stones and metals, their hardness, their brightness, their conductive qualities, are described as the distributed remnants of what was once a unified, dangerous power. This reading may or may not be correct. What is not in dispute is the philosophical sophistication of the framework it implies, that dangerous primordial powers are not simply defeated and eliminated in Sumerian cosmology. They are transformed and redistributed. Their energy persists in the physical structure of the world in new forms. The world is made in part from what was defeated in order to make it. The cosmos is not a clean creation from nothing. It is a reorganization of something prior, something dangerous, something whose nature has not been entirely neutralized but has been dispersed into forms that are manageable. The disease aspect of the Asaku, viewed through this framework, makes a different kind of sense. It is the original dangerous power finding, in human vulnerability, a way to reconcentrate. When a person is weakened by illness, by spiritual compromise, by the various conditions the Sumerian texts associated with susceptibility, the distributed Asaku energy in the physical world finds a pathway to concentrate again, to reconstitute something of its original dangerous density. The exorcist's role is to interrupt this reconcentration process before it reaches a threshold at which the individual is overwhelmed. The specific text that encodes the most detailed understanding of the Asaku's reconcentration mechanism is a series of diagnostic incantations called the Sakiku, the Babylonian medical diagnostic series, which represents the most extensive and systematic medical text from the ancient world. The Sakiku describes hundreds of specific illness presentations and connects each to a specific supernatural agent or class of agent. The Asaku appears throughout this text in connection with fever presentations, progressive wasting conditions, and states of mental deterioration that the scribes clearly understood as having both physical and supernatural dimensions simultaneously. The Sakiku's conceptual framework, in which every illness has both a natural physical presentation and a supernatural causal agent, is one of the most interesting bridges between ancient Mesopotamian thought and questions that contemporary medicine is only beginning to engage with in serious ways. The ancient observers were not simply projecting supernatural causes onto physical phenomena they could not understand. They were working within a framework in which the physical and the supernatural were not separate categories. An illness was both a physiological state and a spiritual condition simultaneously. The Asaku was not the cause in the sense of a germ or a toxin. It was the agent of the illness's specific character, the quality of deterioration that made a simple fever into a wasting condition, that made ordinary sadness into paralytic despair, that took what might have been a recoverable condition and gave it the quality of progressive, purposeful destruction. This dual-aspect understanding of disease, physical mechanism, plus intentional spiritual character is precisely what the biblical tradition collapsed. In the biblical framework, illness is either a natural phenomenon rarely explicitly acknowledged as such, or a divine punishment, or a demonic attack. The idea of illness as a state in which pre-cosmic dangerous energy is reconcentrating in a vulnerable organism, using the organism as a site of reconcentration rather than attacking it from outside, is simply not present in canonical scripture. It is present in the Sumerian medical texts. It is present in extraordinary detail, and it is associated with an entity, the Asaku, whose full mythological development connects the experience of individual illness to a primordial cosmic event, the defeat of a primordial power whose energy was distributed through the physical world and that continually seeks, through human vulnerability, to reconcentrate into its original destructive form. That is an astonishing piece of cosmological thinking. It links the cosmological and the physiological through a single concept. It makes individual human illness a microcosm of the original cosmic conflict, a site where the same battle that established the current order of the world is replayed at the level of the individual body. The exorcist who drives the Asaku from a sick person is participating in the same mythological act as Ninurta, defeating the Asaku in primordial combat. The ritual and the myth are the same event, operating at different scales. The biblical tradition preserved, in the New Testament accounts of healing, something of this structure, the healer commanding illness to leave, with authority rather than medical procedure. But it did not preserve the cosmological framework that explains why that authority is structurally appropriate. It did not preserve the understanding that illness as a class of phenomenon is connected to a primordial cosmic conflict, that the healer is participating in a cosmic drama rather than simply performing a miracle, that the authority deployed in healing is the same authority that established the cosmic order against the primordial powers. And it did not preserve the most disturbing aspect of the Asaku's description, the fact that it cannot be permanently defeated in any individual case. It can be driven out, it can be interrupted, but the energy it represents is distributed through the physical world. It is in the stones and the minerals. It is in the world itself. And human vulnerability, which is a permanent feature of human existence, provides it with a permanent pathway to reconcentrate. The Asaku is never finally done. It is the persistence of the primordial in the world that was made from the primordial. It is the shadow of the defeated cosmos embedded in the cosmos that defeated it. That the permanently threatening remnant distributed through physical reality itself is the fifth thing the Bible did not tell you. And now we come to the sixth, the worst one. Before we can discuss what the sixth demon is, we need to discuss what it means for something to be the worst. The first 5 entities we have examined are frightening in comprehensible ways. The Anzu is the brilliant insider who weaponizes understanding. Lamashtu is the predatory divine feminine who attacks the most vulnerable. The Udughul are the amoral remnants of pre-creation chaos. The Galu are the implacable administrators of the underworld's claims on the living. The Asaku is the primordial dangerous power that the world was built from, distributed through physical reality, reconcentrating in vulnerability. Each of these is frightening. Each is well documented. Each presents genuine problems for the theological frameworks that the biblical tradition built. But all 5 of them operate within a framework that is, finally, comprehensible. The Anzu was defeated by Ninurta. Lamashtu is driven away by Pazuzu. The Udughul are interrupted by the authority of Asalohi. The Galu are satisfied by a substitute. The Asaku was dispersed by Ninurta and can be driven from individual patients by correct ritual procedure. Each of these entities, for all its power and all its resistance to ordinary human response, exists in a relationship with the divine order that makes it ultimately manageable, not eliminated, not fully controlled, but managed, held at bay by the continuous, skilled application of the knowledge that the Anunnaki passed down to the priests. The sixth entity is not like that. The sixth entity is not managed. It is not driven away. It is not satisfied. It is not interrupted by authority from above. It is, in the most literal sense possible given the Sumerian cosmological framework, the foundation upon which everything else rests, including the foundation on which the divine order rests, including the foundation on which the Anunnaki's own power rests. To understand what this means, we need to go back to the beginning, not to the beginning of human civilization, not to the beginning of the current cosmic order, to the beginning of the beginning, to the state of being that the Sumerians described as existing before the Anunnaki created the ordered world. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which represents the most fully elaborated version of the Sumerian cosmological tradition on this point, begins with a description of the primordial state that is one of the most extraordinary passages in the entire ancient textual record. It reads, in its opening lines, "When on high the heavens had not been named, below the earth had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, their progenitor, and Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. No reed hut had been matted, no marshland had appeared, when no gods, whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined. Then it was that the gods were formed within them." This passage is not describing a god who created the universe from nothing. It is describing a state of being 2 primordial entities, Apsu and Tiamat, commingled from which the gods themselves emerged. Not created by an external god. Emerged from within. The gods were born from Tiamat, the organized divine hierarchy that the Sumerians described as governing all of reality was not the source of Tiamat. It was the product of Tiamat. Or more precisely, it was the product of what happened inside Tiamat. Tiamat is described as a body of primordial salt water, the ocean, in the most ancient and fundamental sense, before the ocean was an ocean, when it was simply the undifferentiated aqueous medium of existence. Apsu is described as sweet water, groundwater, the deep aquifer, the water that rises from beneath. Together they are the original state, not chaos in the sense of disorder, but the primal state before order. Not evil in any moral sense, but the medium within which the moral categories had not yet been established. The gods emerge from within this medium. They begin to develop their ordered existence, their assembly, their deliberations, their projects while still inhabiting the body of their parents. And they are noisy, they are active, they are energetically engaged in establishing the patterns of organized divine life. And this activity disturbs Apsu, who wants quiet, who wants the primal stillness to return. Apsu complains to Tiamat, "These gods who have come from within us are too loud. They do not let me sleep. I want to destroy them so that stillness can return." Tiamat is disturbed by this. The text is careful to establish that Tiamat's initial response is not to join Apsu in the plan to destroy their offspring. She argues against it. "These are the gods," she says. "These are what came from within us. We should not destroy them." The narrative is establishing Tiamat, in this moment, as not simply an enemy of order. She is something older and more complex than that. But Enki, who hears of Apsu's plan through divine intelligence, acts first. Enki casts a spell on Apsu. He puts Apsu into a deep sleep and kills him, or more precisely, inactivates him, immobilizing him permanently in the deep. Then Enki builds his temple, the Abzu, the house of the divine wisdom, on top of the immobilized Apsu. The divine order is established above the inactivated body of the primordial father. And Tiamat, who had initially been unwilling to support Apsu's plan to destroy the gods, now faced with the fact that the gods have killed Apsu and built their civilization on his body, changes. She assembles an army. She creates 11 monsters beings that the text describes in terms of their terror. Serpents, dragons, the viper, the Mushusu dragon, the Lamu hero, the Rabisu demon, the scorpion man, Umu Dabrutu great weather beasts, Kululu fishmen, Kusarikwi centaurs, and she places at their head a being named Kingu, whom she elevates to the status of her consort and to whom she gives the Tablet of Destinies, the same tablet that the Anzu would later steal from Enlil. The Tablet of Destinies, here at the beginning of the cosmic narrative, is in Tiamat's possession. She created it. Or perhaps more precisely, she is the source from which it derives its authority. The tablet that governs the fates of all things, the operating system of reality, originates from within the primordial body of Tiamat. The young gods are terrified. Anu is sent to confront Tiamat and returns paralyzed with fear. Ea is sent and returns without engaging her. Finally, Marduk, the young storm god, the champion of the divine assembly, steps forward and offers to fight Tiamat. But he makes a condition. If he wins, he will be supreme among all the gods. He will hold the Tablet of Destinies. He will be the one who sets the fates. The gods agree. And Marduk equips himself with extraordinary weapons: wind, the tempest, the flood, the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, and goes to face Tiamat. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is described with vivid detail in the Enuma Elish, and it is one of the most consequential mythological events in all of ancient literature, because what happens to Tiamat after the battle is what creates the world. Marduk catches Tiamat in his net, a net made of wind, and drives the evil wind into her open mouth so she cannot close it. Then he drives his spear through her and splits her in two. From one half of her body he makes the sky, from the other half he makes the earth. Her eyes become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Her tail he bends up to make the band of the sky. Her breasts he establishes as mountains. Her body is the world. The world was not created from nothing. The world was created from the body of a primordial power that was split in two and shaped into the sky and the earth. The foundation of everything, the literal ground we stand on, the sky above us, the rivers that sustained Mesopotamian civilization, is the body of Tiamat. And Kingu, her champion, the one to whom she gave the Tablet of Destinies, Kingu, is captured. His blood is used to create humanity. The text is precise. Ea takes Kingu's blood, and from it creates human beings. Humans are not the creation of divine love. They are not made in the image of God in the sense of being made from divine substance. They are made from the blood of Tiamat's champion. They are made from the stuff of the primordial side, from the substance of the entity that the divine order had to fight to establish itself. Now we have everything we need to understand what the sixth demon is, and why it is the worst. The sixth entity is not a demon in the sense that the previous five are demons. It is not a discrete being that operates within or at the edges of the cosmic order. It is the order itself, the very foundation of the physical world, and the implication that runs through the Sumerian cosmological texts with remarkable consistency is that the world made from Tiamat's body is not fully tamed, cannot be fully tamed. The material that was shaped into the world retained something of what Tiamat was. And what Tiamat was is the source of everything, including the divine order that defeated her. The Abzu, the deep primordial waters, associated with Apsu but also with Tiamat's substance, is described in Sumerian texts not as a defeated realm, but as a permanent feature of cosmic geography. It is below everything. It is what everything rests on. It cannot be drained. It cannot be eliminated. Enki builds his temple on it, which means the god of wisdom established his power directly above the thing he had immobilized, but not destroyed. The wisdom of the gods is seated above the primordial chaos, not having replaced it, having been built on top of it. Tiamat, in this framework, is not defeated in any final sense. She is incorporated. She is the world. The world is her body. And the quality of that body, its resistance to being fully ordered, its tendency toward chaos and flood and dissolution, is Tiamat's nature persisting in the physical structure of existence. Every flood that destroys a city is Tiamat. Every earthquake that ruptures the ordered surface of the world is Tiamat. Every storm that overwhelms the structures of human civilization is Tiamat. Not because a demon called Tiamat is causing these things, but because the world was made from her, and what it was made from persists in how it behaves. This is the sixth thing. Not a demon that can be identified, named, confronted, and driven away. Not an entity that exists at the edges of the divine order, threatening from outside. The sixth thing is the material reality of the world itself, and the recognition that the material the world was made from carries the nature of what it was before the world was made from it. The Anunnaki defeated Tiamat, but they made the world from her, which means they live in her, which means we live in her, which means everything that exists within the physical world exists within the body of the primordial power that was defeated to create the conditions for organized divine life. And this has a specific implication that the biblical tradition found completely unacceptable. The creator God of the biblical tradition is not building in clean space. He is working within a medium that was something specific before he worked with it, and that retains something of what it was. The creation story in Genesis, tohu va bohu, formless and void, darkness on the face of the deep, preserves a trace of this Mesopotamian understanding. The deep is there in Genesis. The darkness is there. Before creation, something is there. Scholars have long noted that the Hebrew word tehom, the deep, the abyss, is linguistically related to Tiamat. The biblical deep and the Sumerian primordial ocean share a name. The tradition preserved the memory but stripped away the implication that what was in the deep before creation retained some of its nature through the act of creation. Because if it did, if the world is made from something that persists in it, then there is a limit to divine sovereignty over the physical world that monotheism cannot accommodate. A God who is fully sovereign does not build with pre-existing materials that have their own nature. A God who is fully sovereign creates from nothing, and the nothing that becomes something has no prior nature to persist. But the Sumerians said something different. They said the world was made from Tiamat, and they said the Abzu was below everything, permanent and foundational. And they said the storms and the floods and the dissolution of ordered structures were Tiamat's nature persisting in the body that was made from her. And they said this continuously, for thousands of years, with the seriousness of people who were engaging with something they believed was fundamentally, structurally true about the nature of reality. The Bible did not tell you this. The Bible told you that God created the heavens and the earth, and that he looked at what he had made, and it was good. It did not tell you what the heavens and the earth were made from. It did not tell you that there was something before the beginning that retained its nature through the beginning. It did not give you the implication that the physical world is not clean creation but incorporated chaos, that the disorder of the natural world is not the absence of divine order but the persistence of the primordial substance from which divine order built its home. This is not a small omission. This is a foundational reframing of what the physical world is. And it is the single most significant thing that the Sumerian tradition understood about the nature of existence that the biblical tradition, in establishing the monotheistic framework that would govern Western consciousness for 2 millennia, chose not to pass on. The sixth thing is not a demon you can name and confront and drive away. It is the world itself, the body of what was defeated to make the world. The primordial persistence that no ritual can permanently expel because it is not in the world, it is the world. And any organized structure of civilization, of governance, of law, of divine order built on the surface of the world is built on the body of the thing that was defeated to establish the conditions for that order. That is the worst one. Not because it attacks you, not because it has a name you can speak and a weakness you can exploit and a ritual you can perform to drive it away, but because it is the ground under your feet. Because you are, if the Sumerians are right, made from the blood of its champion. Because the very substance of your physical existence is constituted from the body of the primordial power that the divine order incorporated but did not destroy. Because the world was made from Tiamat, and you are in the world, and Tiamat is in you. That is what the Bible left out. That is the sixth thing, and it is the worst. We have been through 6 descriptions, 6 entities, 6 aspects of a cosmological understanding that the Sumerian civilization developed over thousands of years and encoded in clay with extraordinary precision. Let us now sit with the full picture they create when you see them together. The Anzu tells us that the most dangerous threat to cosmic order comes not from outside the order, but from within it, from the being that was trusted, that was given access, that was smart enough to understand what it was guarding, and patient enough to wait for the right moment to take it. The danger of subverted intelligence, the danger of understanding weaponized against the system that was built on understanding. Lamashtu tells us that the divine order has a product and offspring of the highest divine authority that cannot be incorporated into the order's administrative structure, that has no function within the order's purposes, that is purely predatory by constitution, rather than by choice. That divinity and destruction are not mutually exclusive. That a being can be of divine origin and be destructive in nature simultaneously, without contradiction, without fall, without corruption from a prior better state, simply constituted that way. The Udug tell us that there are remnants of the pre-cosmic state entities that predate the organized universe that persist within it, that cannot be negotiated with, because they have no motivational structure that would make negotiation meaningful, that can only be interrupted by authority that predates their own existence. They are the evidence that the creation of the ordered world was not a clean operation, that what existed before the order was not fully eliminated, that the creation of order produced a cosmos that still contains, in its interstices, the residue of what it was made from. The Gallu tell us that the boundary between the living and the dead is maintained by an administrative system that has its own authority older than divine moral authority, not subject to divine moral authority in any simple way, and that this system has agents who operate in the living world on its behalf. That the dead have claims on the living that are encoded in the structure of reality, not in the moral will of any deity. That there is a law beneath the moral law that the divine order does not fully control. The Asaku tells us that the primordial powers that were defeated to establish the current cosmic order were not eliminated. They were distributed, broken up, and dispersed through the physical substance of the world in controlled quantities. That the properties of physical matter, the hardness of stone, the brightness of metal, are the controlled fragments of a primordial, dangerous power, and that human vulnerability is the mechanism through which those distributed fragments reconcentrate, using the human body as a site of aggregation, trying to reassemble the original dangerous density in the medium of a susceptible organism. And Tiamat tells us that the world itself, the physical substrate of everything, is the body of the primordial power that was defeated so that the world could be made. That the material of creation retained the nature of what it was before creation. That the floods and storms and earthquakes and dissolutions of organized structure that continually threaten civilization are not the absence of divine order, but the persistence of Tiamat's nature in the substance from which divine order built everything it has. Together, these 6 descriptions constitute a single, coherent philosophical position. The organized world is not clean. It is built on, built from, and continuously inhabited by the remnants, the products, and the distributed energy of what existed before it was organized. The creation of cosmic order was a real achievement, an extraordinary achievement, but it was not total. It did not eliminate what it was built from. It incorporated and distributed and managed and suppressed, but it did not eliminate. And therefore, the continuous project of maintaining civilization, maintaining the boundary between order and chaos, between the living and the dead, between the human and the inhuman is exactly that. A continuous project. Not a completed achievement that simply needs to be maintained. An ongoing battle against the persistence of what was never fully defeated. An ongoing management problem whose solution requires continuous, skilled, specific, knowledgeable effort applied by people who understand what they are managing and why. This is the Sumerian view of the human condition, not fallen from a perfect creation, not waiting for divine redemption of a corrupted world, but living in a world that was built from material that still carries the nature of what it was, managing the persistence of what was not defeated, applying the knowledge that the builders of the current order provided for exactly this purpose, because they knew, when they built it, that the management problem was permanent. It is a profoundly different vision from the one encoded in the biblical tradition. And it is a profoundly more accurate description of the experience of actually living in this world where the floods come back, where the illnesses return, where the structures built by civilization are continuously threatened by forces that do not respond to moral appeal and cannot be addressed by righteousness alone. The Sumerians did not promise that the management problem would be solved. They provided tools for managing it. They provided the knowledge of the entities involved, their natures, their behaviors, their weaknesses, the specific interventions that could interrupt their operations. They provided this knowledge not because they believed it would eventually eliminate the threat, but because they believed the threat was permanent, and that the continuous application of this knowledge was the only thing standing between organized civilization and the return of what civilization was built from. This is the document that was left in the clay. This is what the biblical editors decided was too complex, too morally ambiguous, too threatening to the sovereignty of a fully good God to include in the text that would define Western religious consciousness. And so it stayed in the clay for 4,000 years, until scholars dug it out of the earth in the 19th century, cleaned off the dust, and read what was written there. What was written there was not a mythology, not a collection of primitive stories about gods and monsters. It was a technical record of the nature of the world and the specific tools required to live in it. It was the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had sustained contact for a very long time with the things it was describing. Whether those things were supernatural entities in the traditional sense, or advanced beings whose capabilities the Sumerians encoded in mythological language, or primordial natural forces that the human mind inevitably personalizes in order to relate to them, those questions remain genuinely open. Serious scholars argue for each of these positions, and the textual evidence is complex enough to sustain all three. What is not open is whether the Sumerians took these entities seriously, whether they encoded their knowledge of them with precision and consistency, whether the documents they left are the product of sustained, skilled observation over an extraordinarily long period. They did. They are. The clay tablets are real. The cuneiform is translated. The entities are described in detail that demands to be taken seriously as documentation of something. And what they document, the full, complex, morally ambiguous, philosophically sophisticated Sumerian understanding of the supernatural world, is considerably more complete than what the tradition that succeeded it chose to preserve. The Bible gave you an adversary. The Sumerians gave you a taxonomy. The Bible gave you a fallen angel. The Sumerians gave you the mechanics of how something falls. The Bible gave you the deep, tehom, formless and void. The Sumerians gave you Tiamat, the mother of the gods, the body from which the world was made, still present in every flood, every storm, every dissolution of ordered structure. The Bible told you the world was good. The Sumerians told you what the world was made from, and they told you, in extraordinary detail, what to do about it. We cannot leave this material without engaging directly with the question that hangs over all of it. What were the Sumerians actually describing? The conventional academic answer is mythology. Cultural products that serve specific social, religious, and psychological functions in their specific cultural context. Stories that encoded anxieties and aspirations and social structures in narrative forms that gave them meaning. Products of human imagination, not records of external reality. This is a defensible answer. It is the mainstream scholarly answer, and it is supported by extensive evidence about how mythological traditions develop, function, and evolve across cultures. But there is a problem with it that the ancient astronaut theorists have identified, and that problem deserves serious engagement rather than dismissal. The problem is the specificity. Mythology across cultures tends toward a particular kind of specificity of narrative structure, of moral theme, of social function. The hero faces trials. The trickster disrupts order. The mother goddess ensures fertility. The death deity manages the boundary between life and death. These are specific in terms of their roles and relationships, but they are general in terms of their operational detail. Sumerian demonology is not like that. It is operationally specific in ways that mythology rarely is. The Udug-Hul incantations specify not just that these entities cause harm, but that they do not respond to food offerings, that they do not drink water, that they pass through walls like water through sand, that they can be interrupted by the invocation of a specific divine authority in a specific form. The Lamashtu amulet inscriptions specify not just that she attacks infants, but that she reaches through doorways, that she comes from the mountains, that her weakness is her pride, and that the image of a specific rival entity placed in the room will cause her to retreat. The Galyu descriptions specify not just that they collect the dead, but that they collect according to a law of substitution, one life for one life, and that this law applies even to divine beings. This is not the operational specificity of mythology. This is the operational specificity of documentation, of records, of a knowledge base assembled through repeated encounter with specific phenomena whose behavior could be predicted and whose vulnerabilities could be exploited. Zecharia Sitchin argued, across a body of work developed over several decades, that the Anunnaki were physical beings, not supernatural entities, but members of an advanced civilization that came to Earth for specific material purposes, primarily the extraction of gold for reasons the texts themselves describe. Sitchin interpreted these as related to atmospheric engineering on a distant planet, and that their interaction with Earth's native population produced the civilization we call Sumerian. In this framework, the ME, the operational knowledge base, is a literal database. The demons are either actual entities encountered during Anunnaki operations on Earth, or they are records of Anunnaki technology and its effects encoded in the mythological language that was all the receiving human culture had available to describe what it encountered. This is a controversial framework. Mainstream archaeology does not accept it. The specific claims Sitchin made about the translation of certain key terms have been disputed by Sumerologists. The astronomical identifications he proposed, equating specific ancient astronomical designations with specific planets in our solar system, have been extensively criticized. But the basic question he was asking, what if the Sumerians were describing something real, and what if their descriptions were being dismissed as mythology, precisely because the phenomena they describe don't fit our current categories, is a legitimate question. And it is a question that the specificity of their demonological records makes particularly sharp. Consider the Tablet of Destinies. Not as a mythological MacGuffin, a narrative device that motivates the plot of the Anzu epic, but as a description of an actual artifact that the Sumerians believed existed, whose properties they described with some precision, an object that encodes the authority structure of the organized divine world, can be held physically and transported, can be used by its holder to alter the outcomes of events, by speaking destinies, by encoding new outcomes into the causal fabric of situations, and whose theft immediately disrupted the functioning of the entire divine administrative hierarchy. If you translate that description out of mythological language and into functional language, it describes something that encodes authority and command structures, is physical and portable, can issue commands that override the normal functioning of the systems it controls, and whose removal from its authorized holders immediately disrupts those systems. That description applies to a specific class of technological artifact, and the Sumerians believed it was real. They told the story of its theft as a warning, as a cautionary narrative about the consequences of insufficient security around the most critical infrastructure of the organized world. Whether or not the Tablet of Destinies was a real technological artifact, and I want to be clear that this is a speculative claim, not an established one, the precision with which the Sumerians described it, the seriousness with which they treated it, and the sophistication of the operational lessons they drew from the narrative of its theft suggest that they were not simply inventing convenient mythology. They were encoding, in the mythological language available to them, something they believed they knew. The same argument applies to the demon taxonomy as a whole. If the Anunnaki were real entities with real capabilities, then the beings they described as dangerous would have been real in the sense that they represented actual threats to the Anunnaki's operations on Earth. The operational knowledge base, the ME, that the Anunnaki provided to human priests would have included, alongside agricultural techniques and legal codes and musical scales, procedures for managing entities that the Anunnaki had encountered and found dangerous. The specificity of the demonological records would then be exactly what it appears to be: documented knowledge, organized systematically, preserved in durable form, for exactly the reason that you preserve knowledge about anything genuinely dangerous. Because you want the next generation to have it. Because you have learned through experience that the dangerous things do not go away, and that the people who come after you will need to know what to do when they encounter what you encountered. That is the most charitable and most serious version of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, as it applies to Sumerian demonology. Not that the Anunnaki were aliens with ray guns, but that they were beings with knowledge and capabilities beyond what their human contemporaries possessed, that they encountered phenomena on Earth that were genuinely dangerous, that they developed and preserved systematic knowledge about those phenomena, and that the records of that knowledge are what we have in the Sumerian demonological texts imperfectly preserved, encoded in the mythological language that was the only language available for transmitting such knowledge across the gap between one order of being and another. Whether you find this compelling or not depends on how much weight you give to the specificity of the records, how you evaluate the various arguments about Sitchin's specific claims, and how much explanatory power you think the conventional mythology interpretation actually has. What you cannot do, what serious engagement with this material does not permit, is simply dismiss the texts as primitive stories and move on. The texts are not primitive, they are sophisticated. They are internally consistent. They were produced and preserved by a civilization that was anything but primitive in the domains where we can test their competence: mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, law, architecture, medicine. A civilization that was sophisticated in those domains produced these demonological records with the same level of systematic rigor they brought to everything else. And the entities they recorded, the ones who think, the daughter of the highest god who cannot be controlled, the ones without parents, the underworld administrators who collect their debts, the primordial power distributed through physical matter, the mother of the gods whose body is the world. These deserve the same respect as documents that the cylinder seals and the agricultural inventories and the astronomical observations receive from the scholars who study them. They are records of something. And the something they record was understood by the people who recorded it as fundamental to the nature of reality, as important to know as anything else the civilization preserved in the clay that outlasted it. Here we need to speak about absence. Not the absence of content within the tablets that have been recovered, but the absence of tablets that should exist and don't. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, destroyed in 612 BCE when the Assyrian capital fell to a coalition of Medes and Babylonians, contained what ancient sources describe as the greatest collection of cuneiform tablets. In the ancient world, Ashurbanipal himself, in his own inscriptions, describes his library with a pride that suggests genuine intellectual investment. He was literate, unusual for an Assyrian king, and he understood the value of what he was collecting. He sent scribes throughout his empire to copy tablets. He acquired texts through conquest. And he appears to have organized his collection systematically, with catalogs. The Nineveh library, as recovered by 19th century archaeologists, represents, scholars estimate, somewhere between a quarter and a half of what was there when the city fell. The rest was destroyed, burned, shattered, buried in the collapse of the building. Some of what we have is fragmentary tablets broken across their middle, tablets missing their conclusions, tablets that are clearly part of multi-tablet series, of which other tablets have not been found. The Udug-Hul incantations, for instance, are preserved in a form that is clearly incomplete. Scholars have identified structural patterns that suggest the collection as we have it is organized according to a larger architectural scheme of which we are missing significant portions. The Sakiku medical series is similarly incomplete in ways that suggest a more comprehensive original document. What this means is that what we know about Sumerian demonology, already extraordinary in its specificity and sophistication, is almost certainly less than what the Sumerians actually recorded. The demon taxonomy we have worked with in this documentary is the portion that survived the destruction of Nineveh, the loss of the original Sumerian sites at Nippur and Eridu and Lagash to the vicissitudes of 4,000 years, and the selective acquisition of 19th century archaeologists who were working under conditions of enormous difficulty and limited understanding. What did not survive? We cannot know with certainty. But the organizational patterns of what did survive suggest that the complete version of the Sumerian demonological knowledge base was considerably more comprehensive than what we have. And certain hints in the surviving texts, references to procedures and entities that the texts treat as known without fully explaining, suggest that the knowledge system from which the surviving texts derive was larger, more detailed, and more operationally specific than anything we currently have access to. The specifically Sumerian demonological texts, as opposed to the Babylonian and Assyrian versions that adapted and elaborated Sumerian material, are even more fragmentary. Much of the Sumerian original text has been reconstructed from the Babylonian versions, working backwards. The earliest layers of the tradition are the least well preserved precisely because they are the oldest, and stone and clay, while durable by human standards, are not eternal. What the ancient astronaut theorists suggest, and here they are speculating, though not unreasonably, is that the original Sumerian knowledge base about these entities was more precise than what we have, and that the process of transmission from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian involved not just translation but editorial simplification. That the priests and scribes who transmitted the knowledge across the centuries inevitably lost some of the technical precision, the specific operational details that would have made the original records most useful. That what we have is already several steps removed from the original documents that the Anunnaki, if we take the ancient astronaut hypothesis seriously, provided as part of the ME. This is speculation. It is interesting speculation, and it is grounded in the demonstrable fact that what we have is incomplete, that the texts themselves refer to a larger body of knowledge, and that the process of transmission over centuries inevitably involves loss. What is not speculation is the significance of what we do have. The surviving Sumerian demonological record is, by any serious measure, one of the most sophisticated and internally coherent accounts of the invisible world that any ancient civilization produced. It is specific where others are vague. It is operational where others are purely narrative. It is systematically organized where others are fragmentary. It is the product of a civilization that took this knowledge seriously enough to preserve it in the most durable medium available to them, baked clay, and to reproduce it across centuries in their scribal schools. The tablets are real, the knowledge is there. And the entities they describe, however you interpret their ultimate nature, were understood by the people who described them as real, significant, and important to know. The relationship between the Hebrew Bible and the Mesopotamian traditions from which it drew so extensively is one of the most extensively studied questions in the history of religion. The Babylonian exile, the period from roughly 586 to 538 BCE, when the Judean elite were displaced to Babylon, represents the most direct and intensive contact between Hebrew thought and the Mesopotamian tradition. But contact began much earlier, in the Bronze Age networks of cultural exchange that connected Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, and Anatolia in a complex web of trade, diplomacy, and intellectual exchange. The evidence of Mesopotamian influence on the Hebrew Bible is extensive and well established. The flood narrative in Genesis has direct parallels to the Sumerian flood story and the Akkadian Atrahasis epic and Gilgamesh epic. The creation narrative shares structural elements with the Enuma Elish. The wisdom literature of Proverbs has parallels to Egyptian and Mesopotamian wisdom traditions. The legal code of the Torah has structural similarities to the Code of Hammurabi. These parallels are not disputed by mainstream scholarship. What is disputed, and what deserves careful engagement, is the question of editorial intention. When the redactors of the Hebrew Bible, the scholars and priests who shaped the canonical text during and after the exile, encountered the Mesopotamian demonological traditions, what did they do with them, and why? The evidence suggests a pattern of deliberate simplification in service of a specific theological project. The project was monotheism, not simply in the sense of worshiping one God, but in the sense of a comprehensive theological vision in which one God is the ultimate source and sovereign of all reality, including all the supernatural entities that previous traditions had described as having their own autonomous existence and authority. From the perspective of that project, the Sumerian demonological tradition presented specific problems. Lamashtu, the daughter of Anu, who could not be controlled by any divine authority, was incompatible with the concept of a fully sovereign God. If God is fully sovereign, then Lamashtu either doesn't exist, or she exists as God's instrument, or she can be expelled by God's authority. The Sumerian description that she is divine in origin but beyond divine administrative control, and can only be managed by exploiting her pride through knowledge of her nature, fits none of these categories. The Udug-Hul entities without genealogy, without divine authorization, without any relationship to the divine moral order were similarly incompatible. A fully sovereign God is the source of all being. Entities that predate the divine order, that have no genealogy within it, that cannot be located within any theological category the monotheistic tradition provides, these are existential problems for the framework. They imply a realm of being that God did not create and does not control. They imply a cosmic remainder that sovereignty did not eliminate. The Galu administrators of an underworld legal system with its own authority distinct from and partially independent of divine moral authority directly challenge the concept of divine sovereignty over death. If God is sovereign over death, then the underworld does not have its own administrative system with its own agents executing its own laws. The Galu made that claim incompatible with the theological framework the biblical editors were building. The Asaku, the primordial power distributed through physical matter, reconcentrating in human vulnerability, implied that the physical world contains an inherent dangerous quality that prayer and righteousness alone cannot address. It implied a permanent background level of cosmic threat that required technical rather than moral response. This was incompatible with a framework in which right relationship with God is sufficient protection against supernatural harm. And Tiamat, the mother of the gods, the primordial power whose body is the world, was the most fundamental challenge of all. Because if the world was made from Tiamat, then the physical creation is not the work of a God who started from nothing and made something good. It is a reorganization of pre-existing material that retains the nature of what it was before it was reorganized. That is a fundamentally different account of what the physical world is. And it is incompatible with the concept of creation that the biblical tradition required in order to establish the theological premise it was built on. The biblical editors knew all of this. They were sophisticated thinkers, operating in a cultural context saturated with Mesopotamian thought. They made deliberate choices. The simplifications they made were not failures of understanding. They were editorial decisions made in service of a coherent theological project, the construction of a comprehensive monotheistic framework that could sustain a community of practice across millennia. That project was extraordinarily successful. The monotheistic tradition that emerged from their editorial work has shaped human civilization more profoundly than perhaps any other single intellectual achievement in history. The framework they built is powerful, coherent, and deeply meaningful to billions of people. But it was built by leaving things out, specific things that the Sumerian tradition had documented with extraordinary care, things that resist incorporation into a fully sovereign divine framework because they imply a remainder, a surplus of existence that sovereignty did not fully account for. Those things are in the clay. They were always in the clay. And the clay was waiting, for 4,000 years, for the moment when we developed both the tools to read it and the willingness to take seriously what it said. We are at the end of what the clay can directly tell us, but not at the end of the question it raises. The question is this: if the Sumerians were right, if the world is made from Tiamat, if the Udug-hul are real remnants of the pre-cosmic state, if the Galyu administer a law that predates divine moral authority, if Lamashtu is genuinely beyond administrative control, if the Asaku is the distributed remnant of a primordial defeat, then what does it mean to live in this world? What does it mean to inhabit a physical reality whose substance is the body of what was defeated to create it? The Sumerians had a clear answer. It means continuous work. Continuous, skilled, knowledgeable, specific work. Not despair. They were not a civilization in despair. They were one of the most energetic and productive civilizations in human history. But they did not have illusions about the nature of what they were working within. They did not believe the work would ever be finished. They did not believe that a moment of final victory was coming. They believed that the tools for managing the permanent management problem were available, that the knowledge required to use those tools could be transmitted, and that the transmission of that knowledge was one of the most important things civilization could do. That is a profoundly mature orientation to the human condition. Not optimistic in the sense of promising resolution, not pessimistic in the sense of foreclosing effort, simply realistic about the nature of the world and the nature of what living in it requires. The ancient astronaut tradition has added a specific dimension to this picture, the suggestion that the original source of the management tools, the Anunnaki, may not be gone in any final sense. That the same civilization whose contact with Earth produced the Sumerian records may still be engaged with this planet in ways that we do not fully understand. That the entities recorded in the clay tablets may still be relevant not as ancient curiosities but as current operational concerns. That the knowledge preserved in those tablets may be less historical documentation and more active manual, a manual for managing conditions that continue to apply. This is obviously a speculative claim. We cannot verify it from the textual record alone. What we can verify from the textual record is that the Sumerians treated this knowledge as fundamentally important as agriculture, as important as law, as important as astronomy. They preserved it in the most durable form available to them. They organized it systematically. They transmitted it across centuries in their scribal schools. They took it with absolute seriousness. And the civilization that took this knowledge most seriously, that organized its entire understanding of reality around the framework this knowledge described, was, by any measure we have available, remarkably successful. For 2,000 years, Mesopotamian civilization was the most technically and administratively sophisticated civilization on Earth. It produced the first writing, the first legal codes, the first systematic astronomy, the first urban planning, the first organized agricultural systems, the first recorded literature. It produced extraordinary achievements in mathematics and engineering. It sustained itself in forms that evolved across millennia, from approximately 4,500 BCE to the fall of Babylon, to Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, 4,000 years of continuous civilization. We cannot know whether the Sumerian management of supernatural entities contributed to that success. We can know that the civilization that developed that management knowledge was extraordinarily successful by any objective measure. And we can know that the knowledge itself, whatever its ultimate source and whatever the ultimate nature of what it described, was organized and transmitted with the same rigor and seriousness that the civilization brought to every other domain of knowledge it developed. The 6 entities we have examined tonight are not mythology, in the sense that mythology is often dismissed as the primitive human mind's confused attempt to explain what it did not understand. They are records. Specific, operational, internally consistent records of a knowledge base that was assembled over an extraordinary length of time by a civilization that was sophisticated enough to produce the foundations of everything we now call Western civilization. The Bible gave us a simplified version, a cleaned up, morally coherent, theologically manageable version that made the world easier to live in by making it easier to understand. That service was valuable. That service has sustained billions of people across millennia, but the full version is still there, in the clay, in the tablets that baked hard in the fire that burned Nineveh and were then buried for 2,000 years, and then dug out of the earth by 19th century archaeologists who could not quite believe what they were finding. The Enzu, Lamashtu, the Udug-hul, the Galyu, the Asaku, Tiamat and Kingu, the bird that thinks, the daughter no one controls, the ones without parents, the administrators of the dead's claims. the primordial power distributed through matter. The mother of the gods, whose body is the world. They are in the clay. They were always in the clay. And the clay is still here. The tablets are not unanimous. They do not all say the same things in the same ways. They were composed across different periods, in different cities, by different scribal traditions, and they contain genuine variation, sometimes contradictory variation, in the details they provide about the entities we have been discussing. This is important to acknowledge, because the consistency that is there, despite the variation, is what makes the overall picture so significant. Let us be specific about what we mean. The Anzu appears in tablets from Nineveh, from Ashur, from Sultan Tepe, and in fragments from other sites. The narrative details of the Anzu epic are largely consistent across these versions, but there are genuine differences in how certain episodes are described, in the specific epithets applied to the Anzu, and in the nature of the eventual resolution. The Nineveh version, which is the most complete, describes Ninurta's victory in terms that emphasize Marduk's eventual sovereignty over the recovered Tablet of Destinies, a later theological addition. Scholars believe that reflects the rise of Marduk worship in Babylon. The earlier versions give more credit to Ninurta and less to Marduk. This variation is exactly what we would expect from a living tradition, a body of knowledge being transmitted and adapted across centuries and across different political and theological contexts. The core remains stable. The Anzu stole the Tablet of Destinies, paralyzing the divine order. The variations are in the politics of which deity gets credit for its recovery. The entity itself, and what it did, is consistent. The same pattern applies to Lamashtu. Her physical description varies somewhat across amulet inscriptions and incantation texts. Some emphasize the lion head, some the bird claws, some the donkey's teeth, some all three. The nursing of animals at her breasts appears in most but not all representations. What is completely consistent across every surviving reference to Lamashtu is what she does. She attacks pregnant women, infants, and newborns. The mechanism varies slightly in different texts. Sometimes she reaches through doorways, sometimes she comes through windows, sometimes she comes from the mountains, but the target and the nature of the harm are invariant. This consistency is diagnostic of something that was actually observed, or at minimum, something that was consistently believed to be observed across a very long period of time. You don't maintain specific, consistent belief in the specific behaviors of a specific entity for 2,000 years based on something that never happened. You maintain it because the experiences that motivated the belief, the experiences of miscarriage, of infant death, of stillbirth kept happening, and the entity provided the explanatory framework that the experiences demanded. Now, this could simply mean that the Sumerians attributed natural causes infant mortality, which was genuinely high in the ancient world, to a supernatural agent. This is the conventional explanation, and it is plausible, but it does not account for the operational specificity of the countermeasures. If Lamashtu were simply the personification of infant mortality, if she were a mythological placeholder for phenomena whose actual causes were biological, then the countermeasures the texts prescribe would be expected to be similarly general: pray, offer sacrifice, hope for divine protection. But the countermeasures are specific. Exploit her pride, use the rivalry with Pazuzu, place his image in the room. These are not general appeals to divine protection. These are specific interventions with specific mechanisms. They imply knowledge of specific behavioral properties, of a specific entity properties that someone, at some point, learned by trying different things until something worked. That pattern of specific intervention developed through trial and error, encoded in systematic form, transmitted as operational knowledge, is not the pattern of mythological projection. It is the pattern of empirical knowledge. Someone tried something, and it worked. They tried something else, and it didn't. They developed over time an understanding of what worked and why, and they encoded that understanding in the most precise terms they had available. The ancient astronaut hypothesis suggests that the reason this pattern exists, the reason Sumerian demonological knowledge has the character of empirical operational knowledge rather than mythological projection, is that it is empirical operational knowledge, that someone actually interacted with these entities, tested interventions, identified what worked, encoded the findings, and transmitted them as the knowledge base that the ME represented. Whether that someone was human priests, developing knowledge through their own encounter with genuine supernatural entities, or was the Anunnaki themselves providing knowledge about entities they had encountered in the course of their own operations. The functional result is the same: a knowledge base assembled through encounter and refined through practice. The question of which interpretation is correct is, in the end, a question that the available evidence cannot definitively resolve. What the evidence can establish is the character of the knowledge itself. specific, operational, systematic, and maintained with remarkable consistency over an extraordinarily long period. That consistency is what demands explanation, and the most serious explanations available are those that take the knowledge seriously on its own terms. One of the most consistent and often overlooked aspects of Sumerian demonological thought is its geographical precision. The entities we have been discussing were not described as existing everywhere and nowhere as omnipresent spiritual forces with no fixed location. They were described as inhabiting specific places, traveling from specific origins to their points of operation, and being associated with specific geographical features of both the physical and the supernatural worlds. The Anzu lives in the mountains, specifically in a high and remote mountain fastness that the texts associate with the boundary between the ordered world and the wilderness beyond it. It is from this mountain that it descends when it enters the divine sanctuary. After stealing the tablet, it flees back to the mountains. The battle between Ninurta and the Anzu takes place in the mountain territory, not in the ordered world of the gods, not in the human-inhabited plains, but in the borderland between them. Lamashtu comes from the desert, from high places, from the mountains. She crosses water. There are specific protective rituals involving the crossing of water that are directed against her, suggesting that water boundaries have significance in interrupting her movement. She enters human habitations through specific architectural features, through windows, through doorways, through gaps in walls. This is not metaphorical. The amulet inscriptions specify the placement of protective images at windows and doors, because these are the specific points of entry the texts identify. The Udughul have no fixed geography because they have no fixed nature. They are the pre-cosmic residue that exists in the interstices of the organized world, in the gaps between ordered structures. But the incantation texts suggest that they are more present in certain conditions and certain locations, in places that have been abandoned, in places of illness, in liminal zones between the human-inhabited world and the wilderness. The Galyu come from the underworld, from the realm below, accessed through descent. They travel through specific geographical points. The 7 gates of the underworld are consistently described as physical structures at a specific location, and the path between the underworld and the world above involves specific waypoints that the texts describe in detail. The Galyu's movement through the world above is not omnidirectional. They follow the same paths that the dead travel. They are associated with rivers and with specific crossing points, with liminal zones between water and land. The Asaku is associated with high, remote places, the mountains, the desert edges, the boundary zones between the cultivated and the uncultivated world. Its reconcentration in human bodies is associated with specific physiological conditions, the heat of fever, the wasting of chronic illness, rather than with specific geographical locations, because by the time it is operating at the human physiological level, the geographical source is less relevant than the specific internal conditions that enabled the reconcentration. Tiamat is everywhere and specific at once. She is the primordial ocean, the salt water that surrounds and underlies the world. She is associated specifically with the sea, with the deep, with the boundary between the fresh water that sustains life and the salt water that destroys it. In the ancient Near Eastern geographical imagination, the world was surrounded by a great salt ocean. The Apsu below, the Tiamat encircling, and the ordered world of civilization existed in a bounded space within that encircling primordial substance. This geographical precision is significant from the ancient astronaut perspective in a specific way. If the Anunnaki were a civilization that had established specific infrastructure on Earth, specific sites, specific facilities, then their knowledge of dangerous entities would naturally be geographically specific. You would know that certain entities are associated with certain types of terrain. You would know that movement between locations involves crossing zones where certain entities are more active. You would know which architectural features are the relevant entry points for specific entities, and therefore which need to be secured with specific measures. The amulet tradition, the practice of placing protective images and inscribed objects at specific physical locations, is perfectly consistent with this framework. You are not deploying a general spiritual force field. You are implementing specific protective measures at the specific entry points. You know the specific threat uses. This is the kind of knowledge that comes from specific, repeated, documented encounter with specific entities in specific geographical contexts. The Sumerian tradition preserved this geographical knowledge in forms that still allow us to reconstruct, at least partially, the conceptual map of the invisible world they were navigating. It was a world with structure, with zones and boundaries and specific locations where different rules applied, with entities associated with specific territories and specific conditions, with a geography of the supernatural that was as specific and as taken for granted as the geography of the physical world. This supernatural geography was not preserved in the biblical tradition. The biblical world has the divine above and the infernal below and the human in between, but it does not have the detailed topography of the invisible that the Sumerian tradition described. The detailed knowledge of which entities inhabit which zones, of which borders require which protective measures, of which geographical features correspond to which supernatural conditions. This was part of what was lost in the simplification of the Mesopotamian tradition that the biblical editors undertook. In the Sumerian world, the knowledge we have been discussing was held by a specific class of specialist, not the general priesthood, who performed the standard liturgical functions of temple service. A specific type of specialist known as the Ashipu, the exorcist, whose training was specifically in the diagnosis and management of supernatural affliction. The Ashipu occupied a distinct social role. They were affiliated with the temples, but their training was specialized and their practice was consultative. People came to them, or sent for them, when ordinary priestly intercession had failed to address a problem. They were the specialists of last resort for conditions that had the character, the texts, associate with supernatural causation. Progressive deterioration, unresponsiveness to normal treatment, behavioral changes of a specific type, illness following certain patterns. The training of the Ashipu included study of the extensive diagnostic literature, the Sakiku, and related texts that categorized illness presentations by their associated supernatural agents. It included mastery of the incantation series, the Maklu, the Shurpu, the Udughul incantations that constituted the procedural knowledge for managing different categories of affliction. It included knowledge of the materia used in rituals, specific plants, specific minerals, specific animal products, and their properties in relation to different entities. And it included, through apprenticeship, the practical experience of applying this knowledge in real cases. The transmission of this knowledge was taken with extraordinary seriousness. The scribal training that produced the Ashipu involved years of study of the canonical texts in their original form. The tablets themselves were treated as authoritative as the encoding of knowledge whose precision was essential to its efficacy. Altering the texts was not a scholastic liberty. It was a potentially dangerous action, because the knowledge encoded in the specific words of the incantations was understood to be specifically dependent on those words. This relationship between the knowledge and its linguistic encoding is something that the ancient astronaut theorists have found particularly significant. The Sumerian incantations are not prayers in the sense of emotional appeals to divine attention. They are formulas, specific linguistic constructs that deploy specific divine authority in specific ways. The efficacy of the formula is dependent on its precise form. Changing a word changes what is deployed. This is not the theology of a tradition in which sincere emotional engagement with the divine is the operative mechanism. It is the epistemology of a tradition in which specific linguistic forms are believed to operate as specific functional commands. From the ancient astronaut perspective, this is consistent with the idea that the formulas were originally actual commands, technical commands in a system that was designed to respond to linguistic input. The gradual mythologization of these commands across centuries of transmission would have preserved their linguistic form even as the understanding of their operational mechanism was lost. A priest who knew that saying these specific words in this specific order while performing these specific actions produced specific results, and who had been taught this by a teacher, who had been taught it by a teacher across generations stretching back to the original knowledge base would have had very good reasons to transmit the forms precisely, even without fully understanding why they worked. Whether or not you accept this interpretation, what is not in dispute is the precision with which the knowledge was transmitted and the seriousness with which the transmission was regarded. The Ashipu training was not a casual matter. The canonical texts were not treated casually. The efficacy of the procedures was taken seriously enough that the entire Mesopotamian civilization depended on a class of specialists whose specific function was the management of the entities those procedures addressed. And when Mesopotamian civilization ended, when the last cuneiform tablets were written in the 1st century CE, when the last Ashipu trained in the classical Mesopotamian tradition died, when the knowledge became inaccessible because no one could read the cuneiform that preserved it, the entities it described did not, on the Sumerian understanding of things, simply stop existing. The management problem continued. The specialists to manage it disappeared. We have spent this documentary on what the Bible left out. It is worth spending some time on what it kept, because what it kept is illuminated by what it left out, and the relationship between the two is more precise than is often acknowledged. The New Testament accounts of exorcism are the clearest case. Jesus is described as casting out demons by command, not by prayer, not by sacrifice, not by ritual procedure, but by direct verbal command issued with authority. The demons respond to the command. They do not respond to prayer. They do not respond to moral argument. They respond to command issued with sufficient authority. This is structurally identical to the Sumerian model of exorcism through the invocation of divine authority. The specific linguistic form of the command deploys specific divine authority that the entity cannot refuse. The efficacy is in the authority invoked, not in the sincerity or moral worthiness of the invoker. Jesus' exorcisms are described as working not because Jesus prays hard enough, but because the authority he carries is of a type that the demonic entities are compelled to acknowledge. The disciples' failed exorcism, described in the Synoptic Gospels in the account of the epileptic boy whose father brings him to the disciples when Jesus is at the Transfiguration, is attributed by Jesus to their failure to deploy the right kind of authority. The formula differs across Gospel versions, but the structural point is consistent. Authority-based exorcism requires access to the right level of authority, and insufficient authority produces failure. This is exactly the operational logic of the Sumerian Ashipu tradition. The wrong invocation produces no effect. The correct invocation, properly formed and properly deployed, produces the necessary command interrupt. The Pauline epistles reference to principalities and powers, archon, exousia, dynamis, stoicheia tu cosmo, preserves the Sumerian concept of a structured supernatural hierarchy, with different levels of authority corresponding to different levels of entity. The language is Hellenized, but the underlying framework is Mesopotamian. Paul is working within a cosmological tradition that knows about cosmic jurisdictions, about levels of supernatural authority, about the need to invoke authority at the right level to address entities at specific levels of the hierarchy. The Book of Revelation preserves in apocalyptic, highly encoded form the cosmological battle that the Enuma Elish describes as the establishment of the current cosmic order. The dragon, the beast, the sea, these are not random apocalyptic imagery. They are the Tiamat complex, reconstituted in the eschatological framework of Jewish-Christian apocalypticism. The Great Red Dragon of Revelation is the cosmic serpent dragon of the Mesopotamian tradition. The beast rising from the sea is the chaos monster from the primordial waters. The battle that Revelation describes as the end of history is the same battle that the Enuma Elish describes as the beginning of history, the battle against the primordial chaos dragon displaced from the past to the future, from cosmological event to eschatological event, but structurally identical. What Revelation added to this inherited structure was the assurance of final victory, not just the management of the primordial chaos, but its ultimate elimination. Tiamat forever defeated, not just incorporated and managed. The sea Thalassa, Tiamat will be no more, Revelation says explicitly. The primordial aqueous medium of chaos will be finally eliminated in the eschatological resolution. This is the biblical project's answer to the Sumerian permanent management problem. The promise that the management problem will eventually be permanently resolved, that Tiamat will finally be fully defeated, that the world made from her will be remade without her. That promise is not in the Sumerian texts. The Sumerians did not believe that the management problem would ever be finally resolved. They believed the tools for managing it were available and the knowledge for using those tools could be transmitted. But they did not promise an end state in which the dangerous things were gone. They promised skilled and continuous management, and they provided, in extraordinary detail, the specific knowledge that skilled management required. The biblical tradition chose a different promise. It offered the eschatological resolution that the Sumerian tradition did not. And in offering that promise, it created the theological framework that required setting aside, simplifying, or eliminating the elements of the Sumerian understanding that did not fit within a narrative aimed at eventual total divine victory. The entities that could not be defeated only managed. The beings of divine origin that were beyond administrative control. The remnants of the pre-cosmic state that inhabited the interstices of the organized world. The law of the underworld that operated with its own authority. The primordial power distributed through physical matter. The mother of the gods, whose body was the world. These were left in the clay. Because including them would have complicated the promise, would have qualified the hope, would have required an acknowledgement that the total divine sovereignty being promised was not based on the textual record, something the previous tradition's experience of the world had actually found. The biblical editors were not dishonest. They were making a theological choice, a choice to prioritize the promise of ultimate resolution over the documentation of the permanent management problem. That choice served billions of people across millennia. It is a choice that created something genuinely extraordinary, a tradition of hope, of moral seriousness, of engagement with the good that has sustained human civilization through unimaginable difficulty. But the documentation still exists. The clay still speaks. And what the clay says, before the editing, before the simplification, before the theological project that shaped the tradition we inherited, is this: the world is more complex than you were told. The invisible world has a structure. The entities in that structure have specific natures and specific behaviors and specific vulnerabilities. The knowledge of those specifics is the most important knowledge there is, and it was given to us for exactly this purpose. The tablets are still there, still being translated, still revealing, in the precision of their cuneiform, the extraordinary seriousness with which one of the greatest civilizations in human history engaged with the invisible world it inhabited. And the things they described are still, if the Sumerians were right about the permanent nature of the management problem, still in the world, still doing what they always did, still requiring, as they always have, the specific knowledge of the people who know what they are. The Sumerians were, above all else, systematic. This is one of their most distinctive characteristics as a civilization, and it manifests not just in their administrative records, the thousands of economic tablets recording grain allocations and land transfers and labor assignments that dominate the archaeological record, but in every domain of knowledge they engaged with seriously, including the knowledge of the invisible world. The supernatural knowledge system of ancient Mesopotamia was not a random accumulation of beliefs. It was organized, structured according to principles that were themselves deliberately chosen and consistently applied. Understanding that organizational structure is essential to understanding why the demonological records are as specific and as operationally useful as they are. The primary organizing principle was categorical. Different classes of entity were distinguished from each other, not just by name or physical description, but by functional properties, by what they did, how they operated, what they responded to, and what they did not respond to. The taxonomy we have been working with in this documentary, Anzu, Lamashtu, Udug-Hul, Galu, Asaku, Tiamat, is itself an artifact of this categorical thinking. Each entity represents a distinct category of supernatural phenomenon with a distinct operational profile. But within this categorical structure, the Sumerians were also attentive to relationships, to the ways in which different categories of entity interacted with each other, influenced each other, and could be played against each other. The Pazuzu-Lamashtu relationship is the clearest example. The protective use of Pazuzu against Lamashtu exploits a known relationship between two categories of entity that the practitioners had presumably learned through experience was predictable and could be leveraged. You cannot know that placing Pazuzu's image will cause Lamashtu to retreat unless you have, at some point, observed that it does. The observation precedes the rule. The rule is encoded and transmitted. The next practitioner doesn't need to rediscover it. They apply what was learned before them. This relationship between categories was itself systematically documented. The Sumerian texts contain what scholars have called omen literature, extensive collections of if-then statements, correlating observations with predictions. If a specific celestial configuration occurs, then specific events will follow. If a specific physiological symptom presents, then a specific supernatural agent is indicated. If a specific behavioral pattern is observed, then a specific intervention is appropriate. These are not inspired revelations. They are empirical observations organized into predictive frameworks. The demonological records fit within this broader omen literature tradition. They are the part of the if-then knowledge base that concerns the supernatural world specifically, and they are organized with the same rigor as the astronomical omen literature or the medical diagnostic literature. Category: symptoms, associated agent, appropriate intervention. Category: behavior, associated agent, appropriate countermeasure. The structure is consistent because the knowledge base was built according to consistent organizational principles. What this tells us about the origin of the knowledge is significant. A mythological tradition, a tradition of stories created to explain and to comfort and to socialize, does not organize itself this way. It does not develop extensive if-then prediction and response frameworks. It does not maintain categorical precision across centuries of transmission. The organizational structure of Sumerian supernatural knowledge is the organizational structure of empirical knowledge of a domain where something is consistently happening, where the happening can be categorized and predicted, and where the predictions can be tested. The testing happened in the practice of the Ashipu. The exorcist who followed the prescribed procedures and saw the prescribed results confirmed the knowledge. The exorcist who tried a variation and saw different results learned something new. The accumulated learning of generations of practitioners was encoded back into the canonical texts, not always, not perfectly, But the texts we have are clearly the products of a living tradition that was refined through practice, not a fixed mythological inheritance that was simply transmitted unchanged. This picture of a systematically organized empirical knowledge base, maintained by a class of specialized practitioners through a tradition of continuous practical application, is precisely what the ancient astronaut hypothesis would predict if the Anunnaki had provided the original knowledge base as part of the ME. You would expect the knowledge to be organized systematically, because systematic organization is what makes knowledge transferable. You would expect it to be operationally specific, because operational specificity is what makes knowledge useful. You would expect it to be maintained and refined through practice, because practice is how applied knowledge remains accurate to the phenomena it addresses. And you would expect, over millennia of transmission, for the original operational character of the knowledge to become increasingly overlaid with mythological elaboration, for the technical to become increasingly encoded in the narrative as the direct knowledge of the original phenomena faded, and the mythological framework that made the knowledge meaningful to subsequent practitioners became the primary vehicle for its transmission. Which is exactly what we see in the Sumerian demonological record as it moves from its earliest forms to its latest. The earliest texts are the most schematic, the most operationally precise, with the least mythological elaboration. The later texts are the most fully mythologized, the richest in narrative, but the most distant from whatever operational reality the earliest texts were encoding directly. If you read them in that sequence earliest to latest, you see a knowledge base that begins as something that looks like documentation and ends as something that looks like theology. And the question the ancient astronaut tradition is asking is whether, if you could go all the way back to the very beginning of that sequence, you would find something that looked less like theology and more like a manual. We cannot go all the way back. The very earliest Sumerian texts, the proto-cuneiform tablets from before the development of fully literate cuneiform, are too limited in what they can encode for us to answer this question definitively. But the direction of the sequence, from the earliest literate Sumerian texts to the latest Babylonian elaborations, is consistent with the hypothesis. The manual came first, the mythology grew around it. The Bible kept the mythology and simplified it. The manual is still in the clay. We have established what the Sumerians recorded. We have established why the biblical tradition simplified it. We have established why the simplification was theologically motivated and what was lost in the process. What remains to be addressed is the question that the ancient astronaut tradition consistently raises. Did any of the original knowledge survive, in any form, through channels other than the canonical biblical tradition? The answer, perhaps surprisingly, is yes. And the channels through which it survived are specific enough to be historically traceable, if not always easily accessible. The most direct channel of preservation is the Jewish mystical tradition, specifically the Kabbalistic texts and the earlier texts associated with what scholars call the Hekhalot and Merkabah literature. This tradition, which claims continuity with pre-exilic Jewish esoteric practice, preserves elements of the Mesopotamian supernatural framework that the canonical biblical tradition discarded. The elaborate angelology of the Kabbalistic tradition, with its specific hierarchies of divine beings, its named and numbered classes of entities with specific functions and jurisdictions, its detailed knowledge of the relationships between different levels of the divine and sub-divine worlds, is the Mesopotamian taxonomy in a Jewish theological framework. The Sefer HaRazim, the Book of Mysteries, a Jewish magical text whose origins scholars debate but which contains elements consistent with very early material, describes a structured cosmology of angelic and demonic beings organized in specific hierarchies with specific functions, and provides operational procedures for interacting with them that are structurally consistent with the Mesopotamian incantation tradition. The linguistic forms are different. The theological overlay is Jewish, but the operational logic-specific procedures deploying specific authorities to produce specific effects with respect to specific categories of entity is continuous with the Sumerian model. The Nag Hammadi text, the Gnostic library discovered in Egypt in 1945, dating to the 4th century CE but containing much earlier material preserved. In a Christian Gnostic framework, a cosmological understanding that is strikingly consistent with the Sumerian model in certain key respects. The Gnostic concept of the demiurge, the being who created the physical world but is not the ultimate divine source, maps onto the Mesopotamian understanding of the Anunnaki as creators of the ordered world who are themselves not the ultimate primordial power but emerged from within it. The Gnostic concept of the archons, the rulers of the material world who are powerful but ultimately subordinate to the higher divine reality, maps onto the Mesopotamian understanding of the Anunnaki hierarchy as the administrators of the ordered world within which humans live. The Gnostic understanding that the material world is not purely good, that it is a creation that contains within it something of the darkness of what it was made from, is the Tiamat concept in theological clothing. The Gnostic texts were excluded from the canonical biblical tradition for reasons that are politically and theologically complex. But among the theological reasons was precisely this. The Gnostic framework implied that the physical world was not purely good, that the creator of the physical world was not the ultimate divine source, and that the material of creation retained something of the primordial darkness from which it was constituted. These implications were unacceptable to the Orthodox theological tradition for exactly the same reasons that the Tiamat narrative was unacceptable. They compromised the sovereignty and the goodness of the Creator God. That monotheism required. A third channel of preservation is the tradition of practical magic, the various textual traditions of ritual practice that survived on the margins of the officially sanctioned religious traditions, often persecuted, often driven underground, but never fully eliminated. The Greek magical papyri, a collection of texts from Greco-Roman Egypt, mostly dating to the 2nd through 7th centuries CE, contain a remarkable mixture of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and Mesopotamian elements that appears to represent the remnants of what had been a more unified and more ancient practical knowledge base. The incantation formulas in the magical papyri share structural features with the Mesopotamian incantation tradition, the deployment of specific divine authorities, the specific linguistic forms, the categorization of entities, and their appropriate countermeasures in ways that suggest derivation from a common source rather than independent invention. None of these transmission channels preserve the original knowledge in its complete, operationally precise form. All of them involve translation, adaptation, mythologization, and varying degrees of loss of the specific operational understanding that the original Sumerian records encoded. But they preserved enough of the underlying structure to suggest that the knowledge did not simply disappear when the last cuneiform tablet was written. It persisted, in fragmentary and increasingly mythologized form, through multiple parallel traditions, some of them operating in full awareness of their ancient antecedents, others carrying the inherited patterns without fully understanding their origin. What the modern archaeological recovery of the Sumerian texts has done over the last century and a half of translation and scholarship is provide a benchmark against which these survival traditions can be evaluated. We can now see, in ways that scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries could not, how much of the pre-biblical Mesopotamian framework survived in how many different channels. And the picture that emerges is of a much more extensive and much more consistent survival than the conventional account of ancient Near Eastern religion, with its emphasis on the discontinuities between Mesopotamian polytheism, biblical monotheism would suggest. The knowledge survived, in reduced form, in fragmentary form, in forms that often no longer understood what they were preserving, but it survived. The threads of the Sumerian understanding of the invisible world run through the subsequent history of Western esoteric and religious tradition in ways that are only now becoming fully visible, as the translation of the cuneiform corpus becomes increasingly complete. And this means that what the tablets say, however recovered, however partial, however imperfectly transmitted, has been present in the tradition that followed them all along, hidden in the margins, encoded in the esoteric streams, preserved in the traditions that the dominant religious authorities suppressed but never fully eliminated. The conversation was never fully broken. It continued, underground, in fragments, across 2,500 years, and now the tablets themselves are readable again. And the full picture, or something closer to the full picture than any intervening tradition possessed, is once more available. What we do with it is the question that the tablets, 4,000 years after they were written, are still asking us. There is a question that serious engagement with Sumerian demonological thought eventually forces: does the world they described match the world we live in? Not in the sense of whether you believe in Lamashtu or the Udug-Hul as named entities with the specific properties the tablets ascribe to them. The question is more fundamental. Does the framework they use to understand the invisible dimensions of reality have any correspondence to what we can observe about how reality actually works? There are three dimensions of this question that deserve engagement. The first is the phenomenological dimension. The experiences that generated the Sumerian demonological records, the experiences of illness, of infant death, of progressive deterioration, of mental states that seem to have no ordinary cause, of circumstances in which human actions seem to encounter a systematic, inexplicable resistance. These experiences are not specific to ancient Mesopotamia. They are universal. People everywhere and always have had experiences that the ordinary categories of physical causation do not fully explain. The Sumerians developed a specific framework for these experiences. Other traditions developed different frameworks. The question of which framework most accurately describes the mechanism by which these experiences are generated, or whether any framework we currently possess is adequate to that question, is genuinely open. The second dimension is the scientific dimension. Modern physics has increasingly found that the physical world has properties that ordinary intuition, the intuition that underlies most religious and mythological frameworks, does not adequately capture. Quantum mechanics describes a world in which the boundary between the possible and the actual is not fixed, in which unobserved possibilities exist in superposition and observation collapses them. String theory describes additional dimensions of space beyond the three we experience. Various interpretations of quantum cosmology suggest that the universe we inhabit is one of many, that the primordial state from which our universe emerged is more complex and more various than any single cosmological narrative captures. None of this validates Sumerian demonology in any direct sense, but it does establish that the physical world is considerably stranger, at its fundamental level, than the frameworks we use to navigate everyday life suggest. A universe with additional dimensions, with quantum superposition of states, with possible bridges to other cosmic configurations, this is not a universe in which the Sumerian concept of entities that inhabit the interstices of the ordered world, that existed before the current order was established, that persist in the gaps between what the organization of the cosmos created, is obviously absurd. It is not obviously true either. But it is not obviously absurd. And not obviously absurd is actually quite significant, given how counterintuitive the underlying structure of physical reality turns out to be. The third dimension is the historical dimension. The civilizations that took Sumerian-derived demonological knowledge most seriously, the Babylonian, the Assyrian, and to a lesser extent the cultures of the ancient Near East that absorbed Mesopotamian influence, were among the most durable and sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world. The knowledge they applied in managing their invisible world did not prevent their eventual fall. But nothing prevented the fall of ancient empires. The fall of civilizations is a universal fact of human history. What the Mesopotamian tradition did achieve was an extraordinary duration of sophisticated, civilized life, a duration unmatched in the ancient world, and a level of technical and administrative achievement that was not exceeded in most domains until the modern period. If the demonological knowledge was simply mythology, simply the projection of human anxieties onto supernatural agents, then its preservation and application provided exactly the psychological and social functions that mythology typically provides: meaning, community, a framework for understanding misfortune, a sense of agency in the face of forces beyond ordinary control. These functions are real and valuable. They do not require the entities to be real in any literal sense. But if the knowledge was something more, if it was the accumulated, systematically organized, operationally tested record of genuine encounters with genuine entities, then its application over 2,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization had effects that went beyond the psychological. It provided actual operational management of actual dangerous phenomena. And its eventual loss, as the Cuneiform tradition ended and the transmitted fragments of the knowledge base became increasingly fragmentary and mythologized, left a genuine gap in humanity's management of the permanent management problem the Sumerians identified. This is the ancient astronaut tradition's deepest claim. Not that alien visitors came to Earth and gave humans agriculture, but that humanity's most ancient and sophisticated record of encounter with the invisible world represents something we need to take seriously, because whether the invisible world contains what the Sumerians described, or something different, or nothing at all, the framework they developed for engaging with it was both more sophisticated and more practically grounded than anything that replaced it. And the replacement has left us with a very simple map of a very complex territory. The tablets are still speaking. Their language is now readable again. And what they say, read carefully and taken seriously, is this: the world is older than you think, older than the creation story you were told. It was made from something that existed before it was made. That something retained its nature and what it became. The beings who organized this world out of what it was knew what they were dealing with. They gave us tools for dealing with it ourselves. The tools are specific. The knowledge is precise. The entities are real, and they have consistent behaviors, and those behaviors can be predicted, and their vulnerabilities can be exploited, and the exploitation requires specific knowledge that can be transmitted and applied. And the management problem is permanent. The floods come back. The storms return. the illness reconcentrates. The boundary between the living and the dead is maintained by a law that does not bend. The beings without parents inhabit the interstices of the organized world. The daughter of the highest god cannot be administratively controlled. But the knowledge for managing all of this was given. It was written down. It was preserved in clay, the most durable medium available, for exactly this purpose, so that the people who came after the people who knew would not be helpless, so that the knowledge would outlast the knowers. So that the management problem, even if its managers died, would have heirs who could take up the management again. The clay outlasted everything. The knowledge survived. And 4,000 years after it was written, it is speaking again to a civilization that has, in many ways, forgotten it was ever said. Whether what it is saying is literally true, or metaphorically true, or the encoded memory of an encounter with genuine advanced beings, or the most sophisticated mythological system ever developed, it is saying something that deserves to be heard. Something that the civilization that first said it took seriously enough to bake it into clay? Something that the civilization that succeeded it took seriously enough to carefully, deliberately exclude. Something that has been waiting in the museums and the universities and the digital databases where the translated tablets now reside, for the moment when enough of us were ready to listen again. The Anzu took the tablet of destinies. Lamashtu took the children. The Udug-hul have no names in the register of heaven. The Galyu collect what the underworld is owed. The Asaku concentrates in our vulnerability. And Tiamat is the world we stand on. That is what the clay says. That is what was left out of the book. That is what was in the beginning, before the beginning, that you were told about. And it was written down so that you would know. There is something that cannot be fully edited out of a living tradition. When you remove a concept from the center of a tradition, it does not simply disappear. It leaves a negative space, a shaped absence, and the tradition grows around that absence in ways that preserve, in the shape of the growth, the outline of what was removed. Paleontologists call this a trace fossil, not the organism itself, but the impression the organism left in the material around it. The Sumerian demonic entities we have examined tonight left trace fossils in everything that came after them. And those trace fossils are legible, once you know what you are looking for. The Anzu left its trace in every subsequent tradition's treatment of the relationship between intelligence and corruption. The figure of the being who was trusted with proximity to divine power and used that proximity to understand and then subvert the system that granted the proximity. This is one of the most recurrent structures in Western religious and mythological thought. It appears in the serpent of Genesis, the most intelligent of the animals, who uses its intelligence to understand the system of the garden well enough to identify the one element it had never been told not to question and to exploit that gap. It appears in the Lucifer narrative as developed in the prophetic texts and elaborated in the Christian tradition, the anointed cherub, the being of exceptional beauty and wisdom who was in the innermost divine sanctuary and who turned that closeness to divine power into an attempt to claim divine power. It appears in the figure of Simon Magus in the Acts of the Apostles, the magician who sees the power of the Holy Spirit at work and wants to purchase it, to acquire divine authority through market transaction. The specific shape of each of these figures, the insider with exceptional intelligence and access, who weaponizes that intelligence and access against the system that granted them, is the Anzu shape. The Anzu was not translated directly into these traditions, but the shape it cut in the mythological terrain of human thought was followed, because the shape corresponded to something real about the way intelligence relates to power and to the systems that hold and govern power. The Lamashtu trace is perhaps the most pervasive and the most consistently suppressed. The figure of the dangerous feminine entity that attacks the threshold of birth, that inhabits the boundary between the not yet born and the living, between the infant and its survival, is present in almost every world tradition, and it is consistently treated as one of the most dangerous and most feared of all supernatural entities. In Jewish tradition, Lilith, whose connection to Lamashtu is now well established by comparative scholars, becomes the haunter of pregnant women, the stealer of newborns, the demon, who must be warded off with amulets containing the names of the 3 angels sent to bring her back. The structural function is identical to Lamashtu's. The countermeasures are of the same type, and the genealogy is traceable through Babylonian Jewish culture. In many European folk traditions, the changeling concept, the idea that fairies or supernatural entities steal human infants and replace them with a supernatural substitute, is the Lamashtu complex in folklore form, transposed to a Celtic or Germanic supernatural ecology. The specific behavior, the specific target, the specific dynamic of supernatural threat at the moment of maximum human vulnerability, these are not coincidental convergences across traditions. They are the trace fossil of an original understanding, preserved across millennia of cultural transmission, even when the name and the specific cosmological framework of the original were lost. What is most significant about the Lamashtu trace is how consistently it was suppressed by official tradition, even while it persisted in folk practice. The biblical tradition does not officially acknowledge Lilith. She appears in the canonical text only as a disputed hapax legomenon in Isaiah. The Church did not officially acknowledge the supernatural nature of infant mortality or the folk practices of protective magic around childbirth. And yet the folk practices persisted everywhere, in every culture that succeeded the Mesopotamian tradition. In every peasant culture across Europe and the Near East, there were specific things you did when a woman was pregnant and when a baby was born, things you placed in the room, things you did not say aloud, things you protected against at windows and doors. The specific content of those practices varied by culture. The structural logic protect the threshold of birth from a specific supernatural threat that targets that threshold was invariant. The folk knowledge and the official knowledge diverged. The official tradition said that God's protection was sufficient for the faithful, that supernatural threats to infants were the province of superstition and paganism, that the correct response to the dangers of childbirth was prayer and faith. The folk knowledge said, yes, and also these specific things. Both traditions coexisted, often uneasily, across the entire history of the cultures that inherited the biblical framework. The official tradition never fully won. The folk knowledge never fully died. And what the folk knowledge preserved in the form of protective practices, whose original rationale had been forgotten, but whose structural logic was maintained, is the trace fossil of Lamashtu, the shaped absence left by what the official tradition removed. The Udug-Hul trace is the most philosophically interesting and the most consistently disavowed by the tradition that carries it. The concept of entities that exist outside the moral order that cause harm, not as the expression of a moral will, but as the expression of an incompatible nature, survived in the Western tradition, primarily in the form of persistent theological discomfort. Every tradition that attempted a fully rationalized theodicy, an explanation of why evil exists in a world governed by a good God, eventually encountered, in practice, if not always in theory, the experience of evil that appeared to have no moral dimension, illnesses that struck the righteous and the unrighteous with equal indifference, natural disasters that destroyed the good as well as the wicked, the apparent indifference of the natural world to the moral categories that human religion worked so hard to impose on it. These experiences generated the tradition's most profound theological anxieties, because they implied the existence of something, call it chance, call it natural law, call it the chaos that creation did not fully defeat, that did not respond to moral categories and could not be addressed by moral means. The Book of Job is the canonical biblical engagement with this problem. Job's suffering is not the result of his sin. The text establishes this with remarkable clarity. It is the result of a test, a negotiation between God and the adversary, in which Job's righteousness is the very thing that makes his suffering possible. The theological framework that Job's three friends bring to the situation, the framework in which suffering is the consequence of sin and righteous God would not permit an innocent person to suffer unjustly, is explicitly repudiated by the text. God tells the three friends they are wrong. And what God tells Job at the end of the book is not an explanation, but an expansion, an invitation to consider the vastness of the creation, the strangeness of its creatures, the limits of human understanding of what the world actually contains and how it actually works. The answer to the problem of inexplicable suffering in the book of Job is not a theodicy. It is an encounter with the strange fullness of what exists, with the implication that the categories through which humans understand good and evil are insufficient to the complexity of what the world is. That is the closest the canonical biblical tradition comes to acknowledging the Udug-Hul. The closest it comes to saying, there is something in the world that does not operate according to moral categories, and your suffering at its hands does not reflect any failure of righteousness on your part. The Sumerians said it explicitly. They named the entities. They described their nature. They provided operational procedures for managing them. The biblical tradition approached the same recognition obliquely, through narrative, through the experience of a righteous sufferer whose suffering the tradition's own framework could not justify. It preserved the recognition without preserving the framework that made the recognition operationally useful. The Galyu trace is preserved most clearly in the various traditions of death ritual, the practices surrounding the treatment of the dead, and the management of the boundary between the living and the dead that persist across cultures in ways that formal theology often struggles to account for. The widespread tradition of paying debts to the dead, ensuring that the dead are properly mourned, properly buried, properly commemorated, is not simply a projection of social anxiety about mortality. It reflects in its structure the understanding that the dead have claims on the living, that those claims operate according to a law that is not simply the moral law of the living, and that failure to honor those claims has consequences that the living will experience. The traditional Jewish practices of mourning Shiva, Kaddish, the Yartzeit, preserve a framework in which the living's obligations to the dead are real, specific, and time-structured. They are not merely psychological practices of grief management. They are legal religious obligations, as the tradition understands them. The dead have a claim. The living have an obligation. The obligation is discharged through specific practices performed at specific times. This is not the framework of a tradition in which the dead simply depart into God's keeping, and the living have no obligations to them. This is the framework of a tradition that still carries, in its practice, even when it is no longer explicit in its theology, the understanding that the boundary between the living and the dead is maintained by a law of mutual obligation. The widespread folk practice of leaving offerings at graves, a practice that official religious authorities in every tradition have sporadically attempted to suppress without ever fully eliminating, reflects the same underlying understanding. The dead have claims. You can manage those claims through specific practices. Failure to manage them has consequences. The practice survives the suppression of the theological framework that would explain why it works, because the practice itself, the intuition that the dead have claims, is more deeply embedded in human experience than any official framework of interpretation. The Asaku trace is perhaps the most contemporary in its relevance, and the most interesting to engage with from the perspective of modern understanding. The concept of a primordial dangerous power that was distributed through physical matter and that reconcentrates in human vulnerability. This is a surprisingly apt description of what modern medicine and psychology are beginning to discover about certain categories of illness that have long resisted purely mechanical explanation. The relationship between chronic stress, a state of sustained physiological and psychological vulnerability, and the onset of serious illness has been increasingly well documented in medical research over the last several decades. The specific mechanisms by which psychological states translate into physiological vulnerability through the HPA axis, through immune suppression, through the promotion of inflammatory processes are becoming clearer. But the underlying phenomenon, the experience of the body as a site where dangerous processes reconcentrate when conditions are right, processes that had been distributed in subclinical form until vulnerability enabled their concentration, has a structural similarity to the Asaku description that is worth sitting with. The Asaku does not cause illness from outside. It reconcentrates within a vulnerable organism, using the organism's specific physiological and psychological state as the medium for its reconcentration. Modern medicine is increasingly finding that serious chronic illness, the kind of illness that the Sumerian texts would have associated with Asaku involvement, involves exactly this kind of internally driven process. The activation of latent, dangerous processes by conditions of sustained vulnerability. The external pathogen model, the germ attacks from outside and causes illness, is increasingly recognized as insufficient to explain a significant category of disease. The conditions of the host matter as much as the nature of the pathogen. The same exposure produces illness in some people and not in others, depending on internal states that are themselves the product of the complex interaction between biology, psychology, and life history. This is not an argument that the Asaku is real in the sense of being a specific supernatural entity that can be located and interacted with. It is an argument that the conceptual framework the Sumerians used to understand the relationship between vulnerability and illness, the idea of a dangerous potential distributed through the system that reconcentrates in vulnerable loci, may be more structurally accurate to certain categories of illness than the purely external pathogen model. The framework may have been applied to the wrong kind of explanation, supernatural rather than physiological, but the framework itself may capture something true about the relationship between vulnerability and the sact, reconcentration of dangerous processes. And the Tiamat trace is, as we have noted, the most fundamental and the most thoroughly suppressed. It persists in the Western tradition in two primary forms, the apocalyptic and the mystical. In the apocalyptic tradition from the Book of Revelation through the various apocalyptic texts that preceded it, Tiamat appears as the dragon, the beast, the chaos monster that must be finally defeated at the end of history. In the mystical tradition from the Jewish Kabbalistic understanding of the Sitra Achra, the other side, to the Christian mystical understanding of the darkness that is not the absence of God but the presence of something, else Tiamat appears as the recognition that the physical world contains something that is not simply the absence of divine order but the presence of something that predates divine order and persists within what divine order made. Both forms of the Tiamat trace attempt to resolve the theological problem she represents. The apocalyptic resolution, she will finally be defeated. The mystical resolution. She is a necessary aspect of a reality whose complexity exceeds our current comprehension. Neither resolution fully eliminates the discomfort she represents. And the discomfort persists because the experience that generated the original understanding, the experience of a world that resists being fully ordered, that dissolves organized structures, that produces floods and storms and dissolution as consistent features of its behavior, is an experience that has not changed. The world is still made from Tiamat. The physical world still has the behavior of something constituted from what Tiamat was. The experience that generated the original understanding is still happening, and the trace fossil of that understanding still shapes the tradition that tried to replace it. The cuneiform tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites contain, beyond the specifically demonological literature we have been examining, a body of knowledge that is only gradually becoming fully accessible as translation of the corpus continues. Hundreds of thousands of tablets have been recovered. Tens of thousands have been fully translated. Hundreds of thousands remain partially translated or awaiting scholarly attention. What is in the untranslated majority, we cannot fully know. But the pattern of what has been translated provides some indication. The canonical literary texts, the major mythological narratives, the legal codes, the astronomical observations, the medical texts were prioritized for translation precisely because they were recognized, from the beginning of Assyriological scholarship, as important for understanding the ancient world. They represent the highest literary and intellectual achievement of the civilization, and they attracted the attention of scholars who were primarily interested in the history of religion, of law, and of literature. The administrative tablets, the grain inventories, the labor assignments, the land transfers, the temple accounts were translated because they were numerous, and because they contained historical information about the economic and social organization of ancient Mesopotamia. They too have received extensive scholarly attention. What has received less systematic attention, because it has been considered less immediately interpretable and less immediately significant for the major questions scholars were asking, is a large body of what might be called technical literature. Texts that appear to be practical instruction manuals for specific types of activity. Some of these have been translated and studied the specific incantation series we have discussed, for instance. But the full extent of this technical literature and the full range of what it covers has not been systematically cataloged or analyzed. Among the categories that scholars working on the cuneiform corpus have identified as containing untranslated or incompletely translated material are detailed astrological texts that go beyond the omen literature into what appears to be highly technical astronomical calculation, medical texts that combine diagnostic, pharmacological, and ritual elements in ways that do not fit neatly into any single modern scholarly category. Texts that appear to be technical descriptions of specific material processes, metallurgy, chemistry, agricultural techniques in forms that combine practical instruction with ritual and mythological framing. And texts that appear to be records of specific historical events encoded in a form that makes their interpretation dependent on prior knowledge of the encoding convention. The ancient astronaut tradition has been particularly interested in the last category texts that appear to be historical records, but whose interpretation has been hampered by the assumption that they are mythological. Sitchin's specific claims about translating certain texts as records of actual events involving physical beings rather than mythological narratives of divine activity were extensively criticized by mainstream Sumerologists, who argued that his translations were inaccurate and his interpretive framework was not supported by the linguistic evidence. These criticisms were substantial and in many cases well-founded. But the underlying question his work was asking whether there might be texts in the cuneiform corpus that are records of actual events rather than mythological narratives, and whether the interpretive framework of mythology might sometimes be applied to texts that are better understood as historical documentation, is a legitimate scholarly question that is not simply resolved by dismissing Sitchin's specific translations. The boundary between mythological narrative and historical record is not always as clear in ancient texts as modern categories would suggest. Ancient civilizations did not always distinguish between the two categories in the ways we would expect. And the application of mythological interpretation to texts that might be better understood through other frameworks is a risk that exists in any hermeneutic tradition. What we can say with confidence is that the cuneiform corpus contains more than has been translated, and what has been translated is more than has been fully interpreted. The history of Assyriological scholarship is a history of continuous revision of texts that were initially interpreted one way and were later reinterpreted as more contextual knowledge accumulated of fragments that appeared meaningless in isolation and acquired significance when connected to other fragments discovered later, of texts whose full import was not apparent until a second or third generation of scholars applied different questions to them. The cuneiform corpus is not fully understood, the demonological literature within it is not fully translated. And the implications of what has been translated, even the fully conventional implications, setting aside the ancient astronaut hypothesis entirely, are only beginning to be absorbed into the broader cultural conversation about the ancient world and its understanding of the invisible dimensions of reality. What is in the tablets that have not yet been translated? We do not know. The shape of what is there, the partial patterns visible in what has been translated, the references in translated texts to related texts that have not been found or not been translated, the organizational logic of what we have that implies a larger structure suggests that there is more, possibly much more. The systematic engagement with the full cuneiform corpus, applying contemporary computational tools to the problem of translation at scale, is a project that Assyriologists are beginning to undertake. What that project will reveal over the coming decades, what has been waiting in the clay for centuries more to be read, is a question that remains genuinely open. But this we know, what has been read already is extraordinary. What has been read already changes the picture of the ancient world substantially, if you take it seriously. What has been read already describes, with remarkable consistency and specificity, a world that is considerably more complex in its invisible dimensions than the simplified account that the tradition we inherited passed down to us. And the tradition that preserved those descriptions in clay, that organized them systematically, that maintained them across centuries in their scribal schools, that treated them with the seriousness that a civilization brings to knowledge it believes is fundamental to its survival, that tradition was not primitive, it was not confused. It was not projecting anxieties onto a world it did not understand, it was documenting something. With extraordinary care, for exactly the reason that you document things you consider important, so that what you know will not be lost when you are gone. The documentation survived. It has been read. And what it says, taken on its own terms, is one of the most interesting and most unsettling things that any ancient civilization has left us. The world was made from something that persists in it. The ordered world is inhabited by the remnants of what it was made from. The knowledge for managing those remnants was provided at the beginning of organized civilization as a prerequisite for organized civilization's survival. The knowledge is specific, the entities are specific, the interventions are specific, and none of this was simple mythology. 6 entities, 6 descriptions, 6 things the Bible did not tell you. The Anzu, Lamashtu, the Udughul, the Galu, the Asaku, Tiamat, the bird that thinks, the daughter of the highest God who answers to nothing, the ones without parents in the register of heaven, the administrators of the underworld's claims, the primordial dangerous power distributed through physical matter, the mother of the gods whose body is the world we live in. They are in the clay. They were always in the clay. They are in the museums now, under controlled temperature and humidity. They are in the databases, digital images of surfaces pressed with a reed 4,000 years ago. They are in the translations, patient academic labor making the inaccessible speak again. And what they speak is the same thing they were always speaking, the same thing they have been waiting, in the clay, to be heard saying again. The world is older than you think, more complex than you were told, more dangerous than the simplified account acknowledged. And the knowledge for living in it, the specific, precise, operational knowledge was given to us at the beginning and preserved and is still there, in the clay. The clay is still speaking. Listen. One of the most revealing structural parallels between the Sumerian cosmological framework and the biblical tradition that followed it, a parallel that has been noted by scholars of comparative religion for over a century, but that has not been fully absorbed into the popular understanding of. Either tradition is the architecture of descent, the journey downward into a realm of intensifying revelation, passing through structured stages that each strip away an element of what the descending being carried with them from above. In the descent of Inanna, the goddess passes through 7 gates. At each gate, she is required by the gatekeeper Neti, acting on the instructions of Ereshkigal, to surrender one of her divine attributes. At the first gate, she surrenders her crown. At the second, the measuring rod and line. At the third, the beads around her neck. At the fourth, the breastplate. At the fifth, the gold ring. At the sixth, the breastplate of her chest. At the 7th and final gate, the royal robe. She arrives before Ereshkigal naked, stripped of every element of her divine authority and divine power, reduced to the bare fact of her existence with nothing that marks her as divine. The stripping is not punitive in the simple sense. The text does not describe it as a punishment. It is described as the law of the underworld, the Kurnugi, the land of no return. The law is that you may not enter the full presence of what the underworld is, the totality of its reality, the depth of its domain, without surrendering every protection against it. You must come to what is below as what you are without what you carry. Only the naked existence survives to the bottom of the underworld. Everything added to that existence by life, by status, by power, by divine endowment, all of it is left at the gates. Now consider the architecture of the Book of Revelation, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls. In each series of 7, each successive element intensifies, each is more extreme, more comprehensive in its disruption of the ordered world than the one before. The structure of 7 stages of intensifying revelation, each of which discloses something about the nature of ultimate reality that was hidden at the previous level, is the architecture of the descent of Inanna applied to an apocalyptic cosmological narrative. The direction is reversed. Revelation moves upward through revelation, where Inanna moves downward through stripping, but the architecture is the same. 7 stages, each one more extreme than the last. Each one closer to the ultimate reality that the journey is structured to disclose. The final stage is not simply more extreme than the previous ones. It is different in kind, a revelation of the fundamental nature of what was always there beneath the ordered surfaces of the world. The 7-stage structure of intensifying revelation is not coincidental convergence. It is the trace of a shared underlying framework of how the invisible world is structured, a framework that the Sumerian tradition developed, that the biblical tradition absorbed, and that both traditions preserved, even as the specific content of what was disclosed at each stage of the 7-stage journey diverged according to their different theological purposes. What the Sumerians were encoding in the 7-gate structure of Inanna's descent was a cosmological claim about the structure of deeper reality. As you go deeper, as you strip away more of what the organized world of life adds to bare existence, you approach something that the organized world cannot contain or represent. The deeper you go, the more you must surrender. And what awaits at the bottom is not nothing, and is not simply more of the same, but something qualitatively different. The reality of what existence is, before the organized world has processed it into the forms that the organized world can handle. This is, in essence, a description of the structure of the Sumerian understanding of reality that we have been building throughout this documentary. The organized world, the world that the Anunnaki constructed from the primordial chaos, is a surface structure. Below it, in increasing depth, are the things that the surface structure was constructed to contain, the Galyu, who administer the deepest laws. Below them, the Asaku energies distributed through matter. Below them, the Udug Hul in the interstices. And at the deepest level, the primordial reality from which everything was constructed, the Tiamat complex, the body of the world, the mother of everything that exists. The 7 gates are not simply a dramatic device, they are a cosmological map. They describe the structure of what you encounter as you move from the organized surface of the world toward the unorganized depth from which the world was made. Each gate corresponds to a layer of reality. Each layer has its own inhabitants, its own laws, its own character. And you cannot pass through a layer without surrendering the protection that the previous layer afforded. The biblical tradition's 7-stage structures, the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, preserve this architectural logic even as the theological content changes. In Revelation, what is disclosed at each stage is not the successive depths of the primordial reality below the organized world, but successive stages of the divine judgment that will bring the organized world to its end and establish the final resolution. The direction is different. The theological purpose is different. But the architecture is the same, because the architecture was not invented by the biblical tradition, it was inherited. And what it originally encoded, the structure of the invisible world's depth, left its shape in the tradition even after the content had been transformed. Understanding this architectural parallel helps us see both the depth of the biblical tradition's inheritance from the Sumerian framework and the extent of the transformation it applied to that inheritance. The Sumerians used the 7-stage architecture to describe the depth of the world as it is the layers of reality below the organized surface, including the dangerous and the uncontrollable. The biblical tradition used the same architecture to describe the unfolding of what the world will become, the staged progression toward a final divine resolution, in which the dangerous and the uncontrollable are finally eliminated. Same architecture, opposite theodical orientation. One accepts the permanent management problem. One promises its eventual resolution. And what is lost in the transformation, what the original seven-gate architecture contains that the transformed seven-seal architecture does not, is the map. The Sumerian version tells you where the dangerous things are. It tells you the structure of the depth. It tells you what you encounter at each layer and what you must surrender to pass through each gate. The biblical version tells you what will happen at the end of history. It does not tell you where the dangerous things are now. It does not tell you how to navigate the layers of depth that still exist between the surface of the organized world and the primordial reality it was built from. The map is in the Sumerian version. The promise is in the biblical version. Both are things that human beings need. Both are things that the traditions that preserved them understood as essential. And the tradition that ended up shaping Western consciousness chose the promise. But the map is still in the clay. And maps, unlike promises, do not require faith to be useful. They require knowing how to read them. The 6th chapter of Genesis contains one of the most discussed and most controversially interpreted passages in the entire Bible. It is brief 8 verses, and it describes something that the subsequent biblical tradition treats with remarkable reticence, almost as if the tradition is aware that what it has preserved is more than it knows how to handle. The passage describes the sons of God, Bene Ha Elohim, seeing the daughters of men and taking them as wives. It describes this union as producing the Nephilim, often translated as giants, though the Hebrew terms etymology and meaning have been debated by scholars for centuries. It describes the Nephilim as mighty men of renown, Gibborim, heroes, and it identifies the period before the flood as a period in which this intermingling of the divine and the human was occurring, and treats this as part of the context for the divine decision to send the flood. The canonical biblical tradition has been deeply uncomfortable with this passage. The standard interpretations that the sons of God are simply human royalty or righteous men, the Sethite interpretation, that the daughters of men are simply common women or sinful women, represent efforts to reduce the passage to something that does not raise the theologically dangerous question of literal divine-human interbreeding. The Sethite interpretation in particular has been dominant in Orthodox theology for centuries precisely because it avoids that question. But the pre-canonical and apocryphal traditions, the first book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the Dead Sea Scrolls, treat the sons of God as exactly what the literal reading of the text suggests: supernatural beings of divine origin who had physical relations with human women and produced hybrid offspring. These traditions call the rebel divine beings the Watchers the Ear in Enoch, and they describe in extensive detail the specific corruptions the Watchers introduced into human civilization. Not just the production of hybrid offspring, but the teaching of specific forms of forbidden knowledge, the crafting of weapons, the art of cosmetics, the practice of divination, the knowledge of astronomy, and most disturbingly, the knowledge of sorcery and the use of the roots of plants for enchantment. The Watchers of Enoch are the Sumerian Anunnaki viewed through a specifically Jewish theological lens that treats their interaction with humanity as transgressive rather than as civilization establishing. The structural elements are identical. Divine beings of extraordinary power descend from above and establish specific kinds of interaction with human beings, transmitting specific forms of knowledge that transform human civilization. In the Sumerian tradition, this transmission is the foundational event of civilization, the establishment of the Me, the giving of the tools of organized life. In the Enoch tradition, the same transmission is a transgression, a violation of the proper boundary between divine and human, which introduces forms of knowledge that humanity cannot handle, and that ultimately requires the flood to reset. The theological difference is significant: positive creation myth versus transgression narrative, but the underlying events being described are structurally identical. What this suggests, from the perspective of serious comparative scholarship, is that the same tradition, the tradition of divine beings descending from above and interacting with humanity, was preserved in two different theological framings, in two different strands of the tradition that inherited it. The Sumerian framing treats it as the gift of civilization. The Enochic Jewish framing treats it as the source of corruption. Both are interpretations applied to the same remembered event, filtered through the very different theological purposes of the traditions that preserve them. From the ancient astronaut perspective, this convergence is precisely what you would expect if the underlying memory is of something that actually happened. If the Anunnaki interaction with humanity was a real event whose memory was preserved across multiple cultural traditions and interpreted differently by each according to its own theological purposes. The remembered event is the same. The interpretation of whether it was good or bad depends on the theological framework of the tradition doing the remembering. What is significant for our purposes in this documentary is how this dimension of the Sumerian biblical relationship connects to the demonological traditions we have been examining. Because the Nephilim of Genesis, the hybrid offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, do not simply disappear after the flood. The Enochic tradition describes their disembodied spirits as the origin of the demon tradition. After the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, their bodies destroyed, but their spirits, being of partly divine origin, not fully mortal, those spirits became what the text calls evil spirits. They wander the earth. They afflict the descendants of Noah. They seek to inhabit bodies, because their own physical existence was destroyed, but their spiritual existence continues. They are attached to the physical world in a way that purely spiritual entities are not, because they were constituted in the physical world and cannot fully leave it. This is a specific and detailed account of the origin of the demonic tradition, an account that is explicitly connected to the Sumerian tradition of divine beings, interacting physically with humanity and producing offspring whose nature was neither fully divine nor fully human. And it is an account that the canonical biblical tradition chose not to include, choosing instead to preserve only the brief and enigmatic 8 verses of Genesis 6 that allude to the events without fully describing them. Why? The canonical tradition's discomfort with the Nephilim tradition is understandable from a theological perspective. If demons are the disembodied spirits of former physical hybrids beings, who were constituted in the physical world and are therefore bound to it, then demonology becomes entangled with the history of divine-human interaction, in a way that directly implicates the divine beings themselves in. The origin of the demon problem? The sons of God created the Watchers. The Watchers interbred with humanity. The hybrid offspring became demons when they died. The demon tradition, in this account, is a consequence of the choices made by divine beings who violated the boundary between the divine and the human. That implication is theologically catastrophic for a tradition committed to the full goodness and sovereignty of God. It implies that the current demonic situation, the presence of dangerous supernatural entities in the human world, is the consequence of decisions made within the divine hierarchy that God did not prevent. It implies that the angels who descended had the capacity to violate the proper order in ways that produced lasting and harmful consequences. And it implies that the demons now afflicting humanity are, in a real genealogical sense, the grandchildren of the divine. The Sumerian tradition, with its more complex and less morally tidy cosmology, had less difficulty with these implications. The Anunnaki's interaction with humanity was consequential, complex, and not fully under any single divine being's control. The various divine beings had their own agendas, their own actions, and their own consequences to manage. The complexity of the supernatural world was a given, not a theological problem. And the dangerous entities that human beings encountered were understood as having complex origins, some within the divine order, some predating it, some produced by the interactions between different levels of the cosmos. The canonical biblical tradition wanted a simpler story, a sovereign God, fully in control, whose creation was good, whose order was clear, whose dangerous entities were clearly opposed to the divine will, and whose final victory was assured. The Enochic material with its transgressive angels, its hybrid offspring, its demonological complexity threatened that story. And so it was left out of the canon, preserved in the apocryphal traditions that the canonical tradition officially set aside, even while it could never fully eliminate them from the culture that the canon had shaped. The Nephilim are in Genesis 6-8 verses, without explanation. The explanation is in Enoch. The Enoch tradition is in the Dead Sea Scrolls produced by the community at Qumran, who clearly treated it as canonical, and in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which does include Enoch in its biblical canon. It is not in the Hebrew Bible as canonized by the rabbinic tradition after 70 CE, and it is not in the Christian Bible as canonized by the Council of Laodicea and subsequent councils. 8 verses and an absence. The shape of what was removed, the trace fossil of a Sumerian tradition that described, in specific and detailed terms, the full consequences of the interaction between the beings who came from above and the human beings who were constituted to inhabit the world below. 4,000 years is a long time, long enough for empires to rise and fall, long enough for languages to die, long enough for the clay tablets of one of history's greatest civilizations to be buried under centuries of accumulated earth, and eventually forgotten even by the cultures that descended from it. And yet the knowledge encoded in those tablets has not been entirely forgotten. It persisted in the shapes it left in the traditions that came after it, in the trace fossils of concepts that the succeeding tradition could not quite eliminate, because those concepts corresponded to something that continued to happen. Infants still died in the night. Illnesses still progressed without obvious natural cause. Natural disasters still dissolved organized structures without moral distinction. The invisible world continued to behave, if the Sumerians were right, as the Sumerians said it behaved. And the folk practices, the esoteric traditions, the suppressed apocrypha, all of them preserved fragments of the management knowledge that the official tradition had set aside. The modern recovery of the Sumerian textual tradition, the 19th century discovery, excavation, and translation of the Cuneiform library at Nineveh and the other Mesopotamian sites, represents one of the most significant intellectual events in modern history. Not simply because it provided access to new data about the ancient world, but because it restored access to a framework for understanding the world, a sophisticated, internally consistent, operationally specific framework that had been simplified out of the tradition that governed Western consciousness for 2 millennia. We are still in the early stages of absorbing what was recovered. The full translation of the cuneiform corpus is an ongoing project that will take decades more. The full interpretation of what has been translated, the application of adequate scholarly and intellectual resources to the project of understanding what the Sumerians actually thought and why they thought it is even further from completion. The popular understanding of what the Sumerians knew about the invisible world is orders of magnitude less developed than the scholarly understanding, which is itself only beginning to approach the sophistication of the original. And within this project of recovery and understanding, the demonological tradition we have examined tonight occupies a central and particularly important place. Because the demonological tradition represents the Sumerian civilization's most direct engagement with the question that all serious engagement with the invisible world ultimately comes back to, what is the nature of the dangerous things that human beings encounter, and what can be done about them? The Sumerians had specific answers, named entities, specific behaviors, specific vulnerabilities, specific interventions. The answers were assembled through sustained, systematic engagement with whatever they were encountering, organized according to consistent principles, preserved in the most durable form they had available, and transmitted across centuries by specialists who understood that the knowledge was as important as anything else that civilization produced. The 6 entities we have examined tonight are 6 answers to 6 specific dimensions of that question. The intelligent subversion from within, the predatory divine feminine beyond administrative control, the pre-cosmic remnants without genealogy, the administrators of the underworld's claims, the primordial dangerous power distributed through matter, the body of the world itself. Each answer implies a specific management problem. Each management problem implies specific knowledge for managing it. Each piece of specific knowledge was encoded, preserved, and transmitted as part of the most important knowledge base that Sumerian civilization produced. And each piece was, to varying degrees, simplified, suppressed, or eliminated from the tradition that succeeded Sumerian civilization and shaped Western consciousness. The reasons for the simplification were not arbitrary. They served a genuine theological purpose, the construction of a framework of hope, of moral clarity, of divine sovereignty that could sustain a community of practice across millennia without access to the full complexity of the original. That purpose was served. The framework worked. The tradition endured. But the original complexity did not disappear. It waited, in the clay, in the trace fossils, in the fragments of folk knowledge that refused to die, in the esoteric traditions that preserved what the official tradition set aside, in the apocryphal texts that survived in marginalized communities who refused to let go of what their tradition knew. And now it is available again. Not fully, not in all its original precision and operational specificity, but in enough form to understand the outline of what the Sumerians knew and why they considered it fundamental, and what the tradition that succeeded them chose not to pass on. 6 entities, 6 descriptions, 6 things that were written in the clay of Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, preserved by the accidental archaeology of civilizational collapse and patient scholarly labor, and now available to anyone who is willing to take seriously what the clay says. The Enzu took the tablet of destinies, and the universe went silent, and it took the wisdom of the deepest knowledge to know how to get it back. The lesson: the most dangerous threat to any system is the one that understands the system from inside. Lamashtu reached into the womb and the cradle, answering to no authority, managing her pride being the only lever anyone had found. The lesson: the divine and the predatory are not mutually exclusive, and the management of certain dangers requires knowledge of specific weaknesses rather than appeals to general power. The Udughul moved through walls like water through sand, wanting nothing, responding to nothing, interruptible only by authority that predated their existence. The lesson: not everything that harms operates within a moral framework, and not everything dangerous can be addressed by moral means. The Galu collected their dead with administrative certainty, executing a law of substitution that even the gods respected. The lesson. There are laws beneath the moral law, and the dead have claims on the living that operate according to their own authority. The Asaku was defeated, distributed through physical matter, reconcentrating in vulnerability, replaying the primordial defeat at the level of the individual body. The lesson. Nothing that was defeated in the creation of the current order was destroyed. It was only dispersed. And dispersal is not elimination. And Tiamat, the worst one, the one that cannot be named and confronted and driven away, the one that is the world itself, is the ground we stand on, is the sky above us, is the rivers that sustained the civilization that wrote all of this down, is the matter of our bodies, which the text says was made from the blood of her champion. We are in Tiamat. We are made from the remnant of what she represented. The world is her body, and we are constituted from it. And the permanent management problem is permanent, because the world that requires management is the body of what was defeated to make the world, and it never fully forgot what it was. That is the Sumerian record. That is what the Bible did not tell you. That is what was written in the clay 4,000 years ago and left there, waiting, while the tradition that inherited the world moved on to other frameworks. The clay held, the knowledge persisted, and now it speaks again. The question is whether we are ready to listen.